Hey guys, welcome everyone to Twilight. We hope you enjoy our videos. If there's anything in the video that you don't like or if you have any concerns, please let us know in the comment section. Let's keep the conversation going, but for now, let's head towards the video. Bound by promise, bound by heart. I told you the girl was sick in the head. What did I say? She's cracked. Amon's low, venomous voice. What a mistake for Charles to have married her. There isn't justice in this world when this ninny throws herself off a cliff and lives, and Charles and the baby. A woman's, higher but no less hateful. My God, if just one of them had lived instead of her. Esme was pretending to be asleep, but Matilda Evanson's words struck something raw and searingly painful in her chest, and she had to make an effort to keep still. As though Esme didn't wish the same thing. As though Esme didn't think every day that she wished her baby had lived and she had died. She didn't feel the same way about Charles. He could rot. A tear pricked in her closed eye, and she willed it not to fall. She had no doubt the two of them would have spoken exactly the same way to her had she been awake. They had in the past, after all, but she just did not want to exchange words with them right now. She hadn't wanted to exchange words with them ever again. That was the point of leaping off a cliff to her death. It was obvious that Matilda and Robert Evanson knew she had done it on purpose. They had always regarded her as unstable, a burden, a fool. She was too outspoken, not devoted enough to their precious son, not devoted enough to them. When Charles had died after a night of drinking, they had berated her for not being distraught enough. They had still expected her to cook and clean for them and their mourners, mend the dress Matilda would wear to the funeral and shine Robert's shoes for the wake, and Esme had done all of that without complaint, and been appropriately solemn at the funeral, too. She had been so grateful that Charles' beatings would stop that she had barely minded at all, but when no one else was around and the mourners had all gone home, they had shouted at her that she was unnatural, ungrateful, a cold and wicked creature from hell, unable to cry even a single tear for her poor husband who had given her everything. Not even that could bother her much, because of her other recent discovery. Matilda had slapped her during the tirade, but in the moment Esme was just happy she hadn't had to tell Charles she was pregnant. He didn't deserve to know. Neither did his parents, but there had been nowhere else for her to go. Charles had owned her, and it was as if they did now. She had no living family, no means of escape. They kept her on a strict allowance once they had moved into what had been her and Charles' home, and never let her hold any money in her hand. It was all charged to accounts. They retained a maid, and Esme was sure she was spying on her. When Joseph, her perfect, soft, wonderful little baby, had died just 3 days after Esme had first held him, Matilda and Robert had berated her endlessly for being too distraught. Even in her haze of grief she had thought it was hypocritical, not just after their complaints over her reaction to Charles' death, but because Matilda had been obsessed with the baby, constantly trying to take him away from Esme even in the few days he got to live. They had remained at the hospital because of the complications with the birth, and Matilda had intimated that his name would be Charles Jr., that he would come home with them if Esme took any longer to convalesce. She was his mother, not Matilda, and he would never be named Charles. Yet when her baby was gone it had been a new round of vitriol. She had barely held him. How could she be so sad? What reason did she possibly have to fall apart when she couldn't even spare a few tears at the funeral of her husband, the father of the infant? What was wrong with her? What was wrong with her? She had returned to their home a few days after she had lost Joseph and resumed her daily tasks. Every night she ran her fingers over the blanket she had knitted for him, that she had wrapped him in when the nurses had first let her see him. But a few days after that, when she had got up the courage to ask when the funeral was going to be while serving them tea one afternoon, Matilda glanced up at her and said very casually, "We buried the baby a week ago, Esme. Are there biscuits left from this morning?" Her baby hadn't had a funeral. Her baby hadn't had a headstone. She hadn't even seen him buried. She hadn't even known he was in the ground. That was the breaking point, and it felt as though something in her body had physically shattered. Esme had thrown the teapot. She screamed and she raged. The maid came running to hear the commotion. They had locked her in her room eventually, but that didn't stop Matilda from shouting at her through the door. It didn't matter, she knew very well what they thought of her. She was a madwoman, she was disturbed and deranged. She was incompetent and foolish and unstable, and now they were stuck with her for the rest of their lives. They weren't so wrong, she had thought to herself, still holding Joseph's blanket in her hands, sitting on the floor, as far away from the door as possible. That was when she made the decision. There wasn't anything for her here. There wasn't anything for her in this world. There was only one way she could think of to escape, escape the way women who went mad did. When she had awoken in the hospital, part of her wondered if she shouldn't be furious. She had failed to be a good wife, choose a good husband. She had failed to keep her baby alive. And now she had failed at ending her miserable, failed life. How apt. But she couldn't bring herself to be sorry to live still. She had told herself she would leave her regrets on the peak and fall towards her baby. She didn't care if she went to hell, like the preachers said you did if you killed yourself. Living here was hell. If she was dead, no matter where she went, she would know her baby was in heaven, wouldn't she? It couldn't be any worse than how she felt every day. Yet in the moments of free falling through the air, heading towards the ground, it was as though things were heartbreakingly clear all a moment too late. There was no solution, there was no plan and no hope, but there was her own voice echoing through her mind. I still have so much love to give. And she was sorry she had done this, so sorry. And then she hit the ground. She didn't remember the impact, but the remaining bruises and pain that shot up her shoulder every time she shifted, even weeks after the fact, reminded her very well of what had happened. She was lucky to be alive, one could say. She had somehow escaped without any crippling consequences, at least. Her most time-consuming injury was a rib fracture. Apparently she realized that if that was what broken ribs felt like, Charles had broken her rib that first spring they were married, and that had been declared healed 2 days ago. She was well on the road to recovery, Dr. Leroy had told her. She had decided she wasn't going to try again. Whatever happened, she wouldn't try again. We have to be rid of her, Matilda said. She's out of her mind. She'll only try again. What if she decides to slit her throat on the living room carpet next time and the neighbors will talk? They're talking now. Dr. Leroy said he could make the recommendation as soon as tomorrow or the next day, and when she's cleared to depart the hospital she can be taken straight there. Terror gripped her at that. The idea of being sent to some nightmarish sanitarium was no less pleasant than staying with the Evansons. She knew it would not be difficult to have her declared incompetent. Her husband was dead and so were her parents, so the Evansons were the only people who had any authority over her left in the world. Charles had always threatened her with the idea, told her she was crazy, but had never gone through with it. She believed Matilda Evanson might. She seemed to have halfway arranged it already. And you think they won't talk when Charles' widow ends up in a lunatic asylum? Robert sounded annoyed. And I have to pay wages for a cook, besides no. Shall stay on. She behaved when Charles was alive because he kept her in line. We've been too lenient with her these weeks after the child. I'll deal with her more harshly. Shall remember her place. Matilda sniffed in disapproval. Esme fought to remain calm, afraid they would notice the sharp intake of breath. Her whole body froze in fear, not only because of Robert's threat, but the way he spoke of her. Even when Charles was alive, sometimes she had caught Robert looking at her in a way that made her shiver. Before, her husband and then her pregnancy had served as a deterrent. Now she had neither. God, Robert, Charles deals with her for years, we deal with her for years, and she couldn't even give us the courtesy of a baby who would live through the night. The tears were pooling in Esme's eyes again. She always thought she was inured to Matilda's hatred by now, but when she talked about her baby, oh, her sweet little baby. His birth had been difficult, been awful, really, with more blood than the midwife knew what to do with and a haze of blinding pain that she now knew had left her barren. But when she had seen his face for the first time, red and delicate and quieter than she knew babies usually were, Esme had thought that there was nothing in the world she could not face for him. She hadn't cared when the midwife had told her she wouldn't have another child. Her husband was dead, she'd never subject herself to another one, and she had a precious baby to love. She would fight for him, she could die for him. But she wouldn't. Here was her reason to live. Here was the only good thing in her life, and he was so good. He was better than she'd ever deserved, ever imagined. Watching him fade away before her eyes, knowing there was nothing that could be done. All we have gotten out of this is a dead son, a dead grandson, and a basket case we can't get rid of. Your fists won't keep her in line. I tell you, Robert, if you bring her back to our house I might take a pillow to her face and end this myself. I can't stand her anymore. Matilda's voice was low but deadly serious. Do that and you'll get it worse than she will, Matilda, I swear it. I told you, I won't be paying for a cook. Mr. Evanson, Mrs. Evanson, it's after 6. I would ask that you leave the patient to recover. A new voice, stern and uncompromising. Esme remembered it only vaguely and did not recognize the speaker. You may visit again some other time. We aren't visiting, doctor. Matilda said briskly. We just came to wake her and dress her. She's coming home with us. Who told you that was permitted? There is no way you will be taking Mrs. Evanson out of the hospital for the next week, at least, said the doctor, with such authority that Esme couldn't help but feel a sliver of satisfaction. Matilda Evanson hated being corrected. We don't need permission. She's our son's wife, Robert broke in gruffly. Her parents are dead, and she isn't capable of taking care of herself. It's been 5 weeks. Dr. Leroy told us her rib is fine again. Mrs. Evanson is not free to leave the hospital just because her fracture has recently healed. I don't recall the legal rights of in-laws to their sons' wives, said the doctor coldly. Nor do I recall Mrs. Evanson being declared mentally unsound. You may take it up with the constable, though, and he can come deal with me. Otherwise, I will bid you both a good evening. Esme heard sounds of annoyance as the Evansons took their leave. Then their footsteps faded down the hall and there was silence. She breathed a sigh of relief and opened her eyes. The most beautiful man she had ever seen in her life was still there, standing at the foot of her bed. He was looking directly at her, and she almost leapt out of her skin. She recognized him immediately, of course. When she was 16 she had fallen out of a tree and broken her leg, and been treated by Mr. Cullen, who was a medical student there on internship. Her father had driven her in the wagon to the city hospital, which took a jolting 3 hours, agonizing with a fractured bone. He had complained about the expense and inconvenience of the journey. Her mother wailed about how no well-bred young woman climbed trees, much less fell out of them and broke her leg, and how beside herself she would be if Esme was lamed and unmarriageable from this. Mr. Cullen had been the only one with kind words for her, and she had found herself talking about the most foolish things, and he hadn't even laughed at her or looked at her like she was crazy. And she had never seen someone with eyes so blue. She had never forgotten the interaction. In fact, she remembered it in mortifying detail. Her thoughts had strayed to him far more often than they should have, considering the few hours he had spent in her probably poor company. Mr. Cullen, drive, Cullen, she greeted quietly, and then felt foolish. Surely he didn't remember her. He had been a medical student then and was now a doctor who certainly saw dozens of patients a week. And it had been so many years ago. I didn't know you worked in Columbus. Stupid thing to say, of course. There was no reason for her to know. Esme Platt. He was smiling slightly. She blinked, stunned. He remembered her maiden name. Perhaps he had seen it in the hospital records. Yes, I returned to Ohio only recently. Then he frowned. You're crying. Oh, she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and brushed the tears from her eyes. Yes, she didn't have an explanation. She let the sentence trail off and looked back up at him. I am sorry. She hadn't seen him here before since she had awoken. She'd mostly been cared for by nurses coming in and out, and the occasional visit from Dr. Leroy to check the progress of her ribs. They all looked at her suspiciously, probably all suspecting suicide just like her in-laws. Suspecting that she was mad. There's nothing to apologize for. Dr. Cullen stepped closer, right up to her, and handed her a handkerchief from a pocket on his coat. A moment passed before she took it. The gesture was unfamiliar to her. Tears coming down her face in front of this near stranger made her feel exposed. She took another breath, trying to control herself. Thank you. I am sorry. I mean, she tried to smile. My husband was always angry when I cried. She had meant it to sound lighthearted, but Dr. Cullen's face only creased into a frown of concern. She had done it again. Maybe she really was warped and broken beyond repair. Of course she knew what Charles had put her through wasn't right, but sometimes she wondered if it had made it so she couldn't be around normal people. That would be his final, cruel punishment, that even after he was gone the things he did lingered to keep her alone forever. I am sorry to be disturbing you, Mrs. Evanson. Please call me Esme. The words came out in a rush. She knew it was inappropriate, but she couldn't help herself. I am sorry. I just don't want to think about Mrs. Evanson for a moment. She hated the fact that even her name now meant that she belonged to Charles' family. Dr. Cullen didn't seem affronted, though. He only nodded. I am sorry to have disturbed you, Esme. That's all right. I mean, you aren't disturbing me. She felt almost out of practice with conversation, surrounded by nurses and the terse inquiries of Dr. Leroy. I wished to speak to you about something sensitive. Esme nodded, unsure what he was talking about. Do you mind if I close the door? No, I don't. He crossed the room to close the door and then returned to her beside, but instead of standing over her, he pulled up the wooden chair next to the bed and sat down. No one had done that during her stay in the hospital thus far. The Evansons had hovered over the foot of her bed. There had been no visitors who wanted to sit and stay. Ridiculously, Esme felt slightly flustered at his increased proximity. She glanced away. Like I said, feel free to tell me to go, Esme, he said quietly. But rest assured whatever you tell me will not leave this room. I hope you will not be offended. My question comes from a sincere desire to help you. You are here because you survived falling from a cliff. Yes, so you did fall off the cliff, then he pressed his lips together. You did not jump. Heat burned her face, her girlish feelings totally forgotten. She knew it was what they all thought, but hearing him say it aloud embarrassed her. How humiliating to have this handsome gentleman looking at her thinking she was unstable and deranged, just as her in-laws had. I am not mad, she whispered almost without meaning to. He looked perturbed. I don't think you are mad. He seemed to want her to believe it, because he leaned over and took her hand in his, looking intently into her eyes. She realized how cold her hands were when they were in his own. She realized that she couldn't remember the last time someone had taken her hand. She stopped breathing for a moment, half wanting to pull away. I don't think you're mad at all. I think you have endured much. And in such circumstances, anyone can be driven to desperation. That doesn't make you disturbed. Shame ripped through her. He had probably heard the Evansons' whole conversation. She didn't know why it mortified her so terribly to have other people know how Charles had treated her, how his parents had treated her. She knew they had been wrong to do it. She knew she hadn't really been the bad one. And yet having other people know it filled her with shame. She pressed her lips together. Did you hear them talking? The look on his face told her that he had, and that he knew she had, too. I take it this was not the first time you heard them speak that way. No, she shook her head. Then I am very sorry, Esme. He spoke the words, she was sure, just as a perfunctory way of showing sympathy. But he had a very genuine voice, and that combined with the way he looked her in the eye, the way he still had hold of her hand. She tried to remember ever hearing the words sorry and Esme together since her marriage. She was sure it had never happened. She was always the one apologizing, just trying to get him to calm down, get him to stop, to let her go. It's all right, she blinked, trying to look composed. Not unstable, not deranged. Many men are rough with their wives. She didn't even know why she was telling him this, when she was trying to seem less mad, not more so. But the words had never passed her lips before, and sometimes she felt she was suffocating in her own mind, unable to share any of her thoughts that tumbled around inside her head like a cyclone. Somehow she felt she could trust Dr. Cullen. He had been kind to her. He had sent the Evansons away. He didn't seem to want to commit her to an institution. I could have got through it if I had been able to keep my baby. Her voice dropped to a whisper at the end as her throat closed up. I was very sorry to hear about your son, Dr. Cullen said. She pushed away the sharp stab of grief that gripped her at the mention of her sweet baby. Ever since she had found herself in a hospital bed when she had expected to be dead, the pain had changed shape. It was just as raw and terrible, but different somehow, more malleable. It made her think of just how much she had loved Joseph, about her thought just before she hit the ground. I don't want to die. I didn't even want to die when I jumped. She glanced away as she said it, the first time she admitted aloud what she had done. She didn't look at Dr. Cullen when she said it, although glancing away sent an ache through her neck. I wanted to escape. I wanted to be with him. But I don't want to die. I loved him so much, and if I die, all my love for him dies with me. I don't want that. I understand. His eyes met hers. Do you think, she took a breath. Do you think the Evansons have a good chance of having me committed, if they wished me to be? My husband is dead, but so are my parents. They don't own me like Charles did, but they are my only legal relations. It is not outside the realm of possibility, as a single woman with no other family, if the Evansons can establish that you are a danger to yourself. A court would have to make the determination ultimately, at least officially, but even if they did not, someone would have to be inclined to force the matter to be handled legally. He frowned as he spoke. Esme understood. Perhaps the law would make it more difficult for them, but she couldn't imagine the law was stringently enforced in this sphere. If the Evansons had he put in a lunatic asylum, even if it was in contravention of the law, who would care? She had no one to care. I admit I didn't tell your in-laws the truth. Your injuries are mostly superficial at this stage. You could heal the rest of the way at home, but not their home. I could not send you back there in good conscience. He let go of her hand, and she was startled at how much she missed the feeling. Do you have any family, or even friends who could help you? Esme went to shake her head, then thought better of it. No, I don't. I did not leave the house much for friends. And my family is all gone now. If I had either I would have left when I found out I was pregnant. She sighed. I am not going back, though. I'll leave, maybe go west. Anywhere they can't find me. She had thought of it a million times, as a desperate little daydream, when she was with Charles. But it never seemed possible, and then she was pregnant and he was dead, and even staying with the Evansons seemed safer than risking her baby on a dangerous journey westward. I don't have any money. They won't let me take any of my things, I am sure. Her things. Her eyes suddenly widened. Joseph's blanket. She had taken it with her when she jumped. She wanted to die holding it. Of course it was gone now, and that was her own fault, but she still missed it sorely. She put it out of her mind. She had cried enough. Now was the time to be strong. If she was still alive despite great odds of her death, she shouldn't spend her whole life crying and being afraid. But that doesn't matter. Nothing there matters to me anyway. Dr. Cullen nodded. Your resilience it's admirable, Esme. But it would be a dangerous trip to make alone. Especially when you are not yet recovered, and you have no prospects once you reach your destination, a young woman traveling by herself. He wasn't mocking her. His words were spoken with a genuine concern which made her almost uncomfortable after years of hearing no words of care from anyone. But they also stirred up the determination she thought had withered and died long ago upon her marriage to Charles. I don't have any choice, do I? I don't have anyone else. I don't think they'll let me leave on my own. She lifted her chin. And I have no prospects here, either. He nodded. You're right. I apologize. I am sorry. You're being very kind to me. His face had fallen slightly when she spoke harshly, or was that her imagination? She felt bad no matter what. You've been kinder to me than I think anyone ever has. Immediately she was embarrassed at her words, the subtle shift in his expression when she said them. That is, you're right. There isn't anything for me out west. But I can't go back to that house. It isn't just the work, or that they dislike me. She pressed her lips together. My father-in-law, he worries me. She felt very small, admitting that, but the way Dr. Cullen had spoken to her tonight had made her feel safe around him. I can't be alone with him again. Even while I prepared to leave. Especially then. Something like anger flared in Dr. Cullen's eyes. You won't ever be alone with him again, Esme. I'll guarantee it. They won't be admitted to your room again. I should have stopped them earlier, but I have been distracted lately. He looked at her. I don't yet know how to ensure it. I don't have much time. But you will be safe, Esme, I promise. He left the room then, and Esme stared after him, trying to take in everything that had just occurred. Her encountering Dr. Cullen again after all these years, and his unexpected perceptiveness, his kindness and her candor. And what she had overheard of the Evansons. One thing was clear to her: she had to get away from them, from her. She wanted to live with a ferocity that surprised herself, awakened and inflamed by the prospect of being imprisoned in an asylum or in the Evansons' house that was little more than its own prison. That was death. She had thought death was the answer once and she had been wrong. The whole morning passed with Esme wondering when or if she would see Dr. Cullen again. She felt certain he had meant to come back. He had said he would ensure she did not go back to the Evansons, and while she didn't expect much of him, he could do little about the state of the world, where a woman could be as good as owned and tossed aside by her relatives if a word was breathed that she was unstable. She had sensed the sincerity in his words. He wanted to help, at least. She would have to save herself, though. She had accepted that long ago. She was aware of the great risk of trying to travel by herself to an unfamiliar place and find some way to make a living. She was aware that nothing would sever her from the Evansons, that she was an unmarried and thus unprotected woman considered part of her in-law's family, no matter how far away she got. But she had to hope that they would not care enough to pursue her. Dr. Leroy's evaluation of her mid-morning did little to put her at ease. His searching glances made her certain he was considering what the Evansons had said about putting her in an institution. It was shortly after lunch, and she was alone in her room, when Dr. Cullen returned. She felt entirely too glad to see him again, considering he was practically a stranger still. How are you feeling today, Esme? All right, Esme said. Little change from yesterday. Dr. Leroy said I am close to recovering fully, that most of the injuries are superficial now. Excellent, I see. He was quiet for a long moment, then stood up and paced across the floor. She frowned, somewhat painfully pulling herself to a more seated position, unnerved by his pacing. He was nervous, she realized. Why was he so nervous? I had hoped you had some relatives somewhere who could take you in. I would have paid for your passage myself. I would not be able to face myself knowing I allowed you to suffer at the Evansons' hands. He was rambling, almost. Perhaps it would be better to let you stay at the hospital until you've recovered fully, but I am afraid I will have very little influence here after Monday to allow that. And then I will be unable to help you at all. Monday, that was 2 days from now. She had wondered at his words the day before, that he had little time, but had assumed he meant the length of her hospital stay and the determination of the Evansons. Yes, I am leaving town on Monday, and I won't be returning. My father has just died. Other than myself, he leaves behind 3 minor children by 3 different women, and I am now their only relative in common. None of their mother's relatives will take 2 more children who aren't related to them, especially not, he shook his head. They all need care, some more than others. And I don't want to see them scattered across the country by people who care little for them. I am so sorry about your father, Esme breathed. She had poured out her soul to this man about her troubles, and he had listened attentively and made her feel understood, all the while something terrible had befallen him. She wished the roles were reversed and she had listened to him, even if she didn't know what words of comfort she could have offered. He shook his head slightly. There's no need to be. My siblings have never had an abundance of the things that matter, love, care, family, but they each have a vast personal fortune, though they won't receive it until they reach their majority at 21. The eldest is only 17, so they have some years to go. The relatives who now step forward to claim them are motivated by greed, not by family bonds, but greed is a powerful motivator. So you'll take them in instead by yourself. He walked to her window and then back again, hands folded behind his back. I am already aware of at least one threat to contest my wardship of them. I am 29, and I am a lifelong bachelor. This is what will be used against me, to call me unfit to bring the children into my home. I can do nothing about my age, but I do not have to be a bachelor. I am going to return home and marry as soon as possible. He looked away from her as he spoke these last words. Esme said nothing, waiting for him to continue. Her heart felt odd, beating too strong against her rib cage. Our circumstances make me think we could be of some use to each other. He frowned at his own words. That is, I need a wife. And not just some 19-year-old from a bride agency, but a respectable woman who can make the children feel cared for. Loved. You need a place of your own, and money, and safety. The protection of a husband. He looked her in the eye. Come with me when I leave. As my wife. Marry Alice, my youngest sister. It will be 6 years until she turns 21. If after that you decide you would prefer to go west, marry again, anything, I would not stand in your way. If you would like to continue the arrangement and remain as the lady of the house at the Cullen estate, I would welcome that as well. I planned never to marry, so you needn't worry about my falling in love with some woman and regretting our bargain. Obviously the marriage would be, in name only. You don't have to worry about that, either. But as my wife you would of course have access to the household funds, be in charge of the servants, and such. Esme opened her mouth and found that she had no idea what to say. What Dr. Cullen was proposing. She believed him when he said he had not entered with this plan in mind. He seemed too genuinely distressed at the prospect of her returning to the Evansons, and besides, a woman who had admitted to him her intention to end her own life was unlikely to be an ideal wife, even if the intent had been fleeting. Something in her trusted him. Maybe it was because she was right, despite her awkwardness, he was the nicest to her that anyone had ever been. That was dangerous, she knew. The world and the people in it were very often unkind, as she had learnt painfully time and time again throughout her life. She shouldn't fall for the first kindness someone showed her just because it was so different from how people were normally. That didn't mean Dr. Cullen was a good person. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was safe with him. She had never really felt safe with Charles, and she liked to think that years of danger had made her more aware of who she could trust, and who she couldn't. And he was right. Having a new husband would break any lingering claim the Evanson family had on her, even as it bound her to Dr. Cullen instead. She would be able to travel in safety, and have a destination in mind instead of a vague hope that there was a boarding house somewhere willing to take unmarried women, which was not always the case. I hope I have not frightened you. Or that you will feel pressured to agree out of any obligation to me. He said into her silence. I don't know how else to ensure your. Tell me about the children, she said. 17 years old, not little children, to be sure, but nearly a decade younger than she was at 26. At 17 she had thought of herself as an adult, Now she knew that she had still been so very young. And to be orphaned at that age too. Dr. Cullen looked surprised. My contact with my father was infrequent, and he spoke little of his children. Most of what I know is what I have learned in the last few days. Edward is 17, and he was born to my father's second wife. She died when he was 8 or so of fever, after I had already left home. Rosalie is 16, and her mother was a mistress of my father's. She is in Europe, I believe, and no one has seen her in several years. And Mary Alice is ill. She has been in a sanitarium for much of her life. I plan to change that. He sighed. I am not trying to deceive you. My father and I were not close. My own upbringing was unpleasant. I left home quite young. Edward and I lived together with our father and his mother, but I left home when he was 8 years old, and I only met Rosalie a few times before then when I visited Seattle with my father in business. I know nothing about Mary Alice except what I have told you. My father refused to tell me the names of her afflictions. It is possible he was uninterested in learning what ailed her himself. We spoke very little and it always ended badly, and he had no interest in my knowing my younger siblings. He did not have much interest in knowing them himself. Esme nodded. Her heart was already breaking for the children, and she had never even laid eyes on them. I still have so much love to give. Her thought just before the world went black. Her reason to keep living in a world where her baby was gone. She could love these children who surely thought they were grown and beyond the need for family and care, who had probably gone through far more than Dr. Cullen even knew. She knew she could. She wanted to. But there was so much she didn't know. To agree to marry a man she had only met once before yesterday, even if that meeting seemed indelibly printed on her brain, to move with him, too. Where are you going? She didn't even know. The family estate is in Washington. She nodded. It's rainy there, isn't it? The sunny days are far outnumbered by the overcast ones. The forests are peaceful, though. The house is in the woods, although there's a small town nearby. She didn't have many winter clothes. She didn't have any, actually, when she considered that she would be unlikely to get her things from the Evanson house. The place would probably need a lot of wood in the winter. She wondered if the Cullen children did chores. It didn't sound like it, if they were wealthy boarding school students. Esme blinked, astounded by how she was considering all of this. As though it was normal. As though it made any sense at all. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more she felt calm and hopeful. She didn't think she would ever feel hopeful again. I'll leave you to think about it now, he said softly. And whatever you decide, I will do what I can to ensure you don't go back to the Evansons, anything in my power. Thank you, Dr. Cullen. He made as though to leave, and she wondered how long she would sit here, contemplating. He paused at the door, though, and turned. I meant to say this yesterday. I almost forgot. He crossed the room again, this time going to the nightstand beside the bed. He opened the drawer and pulled out. Oh, she breathed, holding out her hands even before he had turned around. Oh, I knitted this for Joseph. I had it when. He placed it in her hands and she couldn't stop tears springing to her eyes again to feel it in her hands. Just knowing that she was holding something that he had touched made her feel a bit better. You were holding it when you were brought in. Your mother-in-law wanted it thrown out, but I told the nurse to keep it in the drawer until you could decide what to do with it. It seemed important. She turned it over in her hands. The delicate pink and white yarn was marred now by a spatter of brown in the corner, and she frowned. My blood. I wonder if this prevented your skull from hitting the rocks head-on, he said. I don't know for certain, of course. But it's a possibility. Yes, she said softly, and Dr. Cullen turned to leave. Yes, she said, louder. He turned. My answer is yes. I'll go with you to Washington. As your wife. He actually smiled when she said that, then looked unsure. You've thought about it? Yes, as much as one could in 10 minutes. Her eyes met his. Women at bride agencies know even less of their husbands and they still marry them. You must know, if you've seen my medical records, that I can never have another child, and I wouldn't want to, really. But all I have ever wanted is a household where I am safe and a family I can love. She pressed her lips together, remembering clearly Dr. Cullen's words, that he never planned on marrying. There would be nothing romantic there. That was fine, better than fine. She had stopped dreaming of romance long ago, when she realized her husband didn't care if she lived or died. Love the children, I mean. Yes, of course, he nodded. Then, thank you, Esme. That doesn't seem like a strong enough response, But then, I don't know what would be for a situation like this. I hope this will be beneficial for the both of us. I hope so, too, she said, and she realized she was smiling. She wouldn't be a burden to him after he had saved her like this. She wouldn't let herself. She fell asleep that night holding Joseph's blanket in her arms, frightened by the enormity of the choice she had just made, but also exhilarated. Maybe this was the start of something better. Things couldn't get much worse, anyway. She had nothing left to lose. Carlisle had arrived at his hospital one morning with the news that a woman had been brought in a few hours before, discovered by a hunter at the bottom of a cliff near the woods. By some stroke of fortune she had managed to escape with her life, but had a seriously dislocated shoulder, 4 broken ribs, a badly sprained ankle, a collarbone fracture, 2 sprained wrists, and she was covered with bruising and scrapes. Most pressing was her significant head wound and the extensive blood loss which had nearly killed her. She had not regained consciousness since being found. When he had first laid eyes on her, he had immediately recognized her, despite the scratches and bruises and dried blood on her face, despite the fact that she wasn't a teenager anymore. He had almost said her name aloud before realizing how strange that would be, and instead he had gone to work. Once she was out of danger, he had let Dr. Leroy take over her care. The way he had felt seeing her again, after 10 years, he didn't want to be there when she woke up, and he didn't know exactly why. He had been more disappointed than he wanted to admit to himself that she had stayed. He had always imagined Esme Platt having left Ohio, just as she told him she wanted all those years ago. He had believed in her, in the amber spark of promise in her brown eyes. He hadn't been able to stop himself from reading her charts, though, observing her progress from afar as she recovered over the weeks. She had had to remain in the hospital because of the delicacy of her broken ribs, some of the most difficult bones to set. The nurses all gossiped that she had probably done it on purpose, that her husband and her son were dead within months of each other, she was barren, that she was probably headed for the lunatic asylum, and it made him ache to think about. Leroy still subscribed to the belief that suicide was the sign of a diseased mind and the treatment was blank walls and bland food, so he had been happy to hand Mrs. Evanson back off as a patient in the final days of her recuperation. Carlisle started to linger in her room for a few moments when things on the floor were quiet and she was sleeping. He just wanted to see for himself that she was all right. He left her a book so she would have something to distract her. He wondered if she would remember him if she opened her eyes. He wondered what could be done to save her from the fate awaiting her. That was what he had been doing today, aware that at some point before she was discharged, he would have to speak to her about what had happened, try to help her in any way he could so that she would never take such a drastic action again. Instead, he had heard her mother and father-in-law discussing how much they despised her, how they would keep her in line the way their son had, how they contemplated sending her away to an institution for the insane. Suddenly everything was clear to him, the odd injuries very unlikely to have been caused by her fall, like the broken rib that seemed to have already cracked and healed years before, the chips in 3 of her back teeth, the long scar on her thigh, the burns on her stomach. He had been told she had birthed and lost a baby shortly before her fall, had seen the record of the rupture bleeding that resulted in a hysterectomy, but wouldn't have believed it otherwise, she was so thin. And she had no one. Somehow when he asked Esme if she would be his wife, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. An arrangement to solve both of their most pressing problems. A way to keep her safe. And Carlisle knew that if he let her go to face danger and uncertainty and the possibility of imprisonment in an asylum he would never forgive himself, would wonder until the end of his days about her. Perhaps it all seemed somewhat sane because the world had turned upside down for him 3 days before, when he had received the telegram about his father's death, and then a letter from his father's lawyer stating that he had died after a brief bout of pneumonia close to 2 weeks before. His father had been imposing, vicious at times, intelligent at others, but never anything frail or ill or remotely mortal. Even though he had not seen the man in over a decade, it was still strange to contemplate a world where he did not exist. Carlisle was now the head of the Cullen family, and what a family it was. He didn't even know why he hadn't been disinherited from his father's will, why he had still been given everything, if not just that the man had been positive that one day Carlisle would change his mind, see things his way and bow to his iron will. His father had certainly done enough to break him when he raised his eldest son. For just one moment he had imagined ignoring it all, staying away, transferring the controlling interest in the businesses into trusts for the children and appointing legal guardians. Remaining at the hospital, but even as he had thought of it he knew that wasn't what was going to happen. The town depended on the Cullen mines, on Cullen shipping, on Cullen lumber. He couldn't just ignore the industries and let them fall into ruin. More than that, he couldn't just ignore his brother and sisters. After he had been disowned, he and his father had had only very sparing contact, and his father had always made it clear that he would not tolerate anything more until Carlisle capitulated to him. Owing to the enmity between himself and his father, he knew very little of his siblings, especially the girls. It was not as though there were family Christmases. But that did not mean they weren't a family. His father wasn't around to prevent it anymore. And further, his siblings would need him. Mary Alice, for one, had to be brought out of the place she was in as soon as possible, and now he could actually accomplish such a thing. For another, there was no question that otherwise they would be shuffled off to their three respective mothers' families. No one in the extended, tangled web of family history that their father had woven cared anything for the children. But the letter from the lawyer confirmed that there would be $2 million for each of them on their 21st birthdays, and further money in trusts accessible when they turned 25. That was enough to spark some interest in their relatives who had until now been very distant, and Carlisle did not think that interest was out of anything but greed. Besides, they were a family. They should be together. So almost before he had finished with the letter, Carlisle had decided that he would be returning to Washington as soon as possible, sending for his siblings, attempting to make some sort of life there. He owed them that much. It was then that he first considered that a wife would be beneficial. He would have responsibilities all day, and someone needed to manage the household. It was nearly summer, so the children would be home all day, not in school. And his siblings, though not young children, would do better under the care and supervision of someone who could be kind to them. They surely hadn't received much kindness in that house. When he received a second letter the next day, this one from Anthony Masson, brother of the late Elizabeth Masson, suggesting that his dear nephew Edward should be put under his guardianship upon the unfortunate demise of his father, acknowledging that Carlisle was little more than a decade older than Edward, with no sort of household or family of his own, and it would be good for Edward to be in a house with other children, a mother, a father. Then Carlisle knew a wife was a necessity. He would prevent these opportunistic relatives from taking any of his siblings away to satisfy their own greed. He had a professional career, an excellent reputation, and now that his father had died, a vast personal fortune and control of a business empire. But much of that could be turned against him, too. He was older than his siblings, but not the age a father would be. He was a lifelong bachelor who kept no household of his own, in a profession which kept him away from home for long stretches of time. He had no experience, no time, nothing to offer a young person in his care. He could explain that it was obvious none of the siblings' relatives had cared for their situation until the money was settled on them, tell how none of them had ever written or visited, that the children had never met them. But they could respond that Carlisle had never written or visited, couldn't they? He had never even met Mary Alice. His father would not tell him where she was. He hadn't learned she was in a Florida sanitarium until the lawyer had told him yesterday. He honestly did not know what a court would make of his situation. He didn't want to risk it. More than that, he didn't want any of the children to have to live through a drawn-out court proceeding to decide where they would spend the next 5 years of their lives. They had just lost their father, and Carlisle knew their feelings about the man and his death were surely as complicated as his own. He hadn't been a good man. But there hadn't been anyone else. So it was settled, immediately. He had responsibilities, and he would shoulder them. When the challengers came, they would be challenging a happily married family man, back at the estate in Washington, living some semblance of pleasantly with his brother, his sisters, and his wife. It only took a few minutes to resolve to change his life completely, in every way, so why not propose to a patient while he was at it? And he couldn't just leave her there. The idea was repulsive, nonsensical. He had known the moment her eyes had met his today that he wasn't going to let her just disappear from his life once more as a patient he could do no more for. He had always thought of her, he had never forgotten her, he was a man who believed in God. Maybe God had been saying then that he wasn't done with her yet, that there was some other way he could help her. It was a way to solve both of their problems, wasn't it? He tried to convince himself he had done the right thing. If it had been possible, he would have offered to take her with him without the bond of marriage, to deliver her to some place where she could make a new life for herself away from those who had made her suffer. As soon as he had laid eyes on Esme, he had been resolved to protect her. He saw the way her father-in-law had looked at her in the hospital bed, appraising Ly. It had made his blood boil. When he had understood what she had suffered, his resolve had only increased. She had to be put somewhere, taken care of somehow, so that she could be happy and safe. It was the only way he could live with himself. It had been his intention to learn who he could help her go to, relatives, friends who would offer her a safe place to land. But he could not deny that his first thought was that he wanted to do that himself. The world had been very cruel to her. He did not trust it to be kinder to her now. If he was the only one who recognized what an extraordinary person she was, then he would have to be the one to treat her as she ought to be treated. Of course, he knew that was ludicrous. But there was nowhere for a young, poor, unmarried woman to go that would offer much security or safety. It was so easy for her to become a victim again when those around her realized there was no man to claim and protect her. No one deserved such treatment, but especially not when she was so kind. He saw it in the way she spoke of her son, the concern on her face when he mentioned his father's death, as though she should be worrying about anyone else's problems at the moment. Yet she was also very strong. She had survived all of this, and continued on. She had managed to smile just today, despite all the darkness around her. That was the problem, though. This marriage would solve his dilemma. He already could tell that Esme was practical, mature, compassionate, everything he could want for a wife to fulfill his purposes. And Esme had nowhere to go, and no one to help her. He would change that, be able to offer her safety and a home. But when she smiled at him, he couldn't help but wish she was plain. Esme was beautiful. Currently she was injured and tired, but even amidst the bruises, the fading scar on her temple, the dark circles under her eyes, she was beautiful. That was dangerous. That wasn't why he was marrying her. He already felt as though he was taking advantage of a widow with nowhere else to go, advantage of the girl he had been unable to forget all those years ago. It felt wrong for him to take any measure of personal satisfaction from any of this. He wouldn't insult her with. He had made it very clear that their relationship was to be name only. She wouldn't have to worry. He couldn't imagine she was interested in anything else. After all she must have endured at the hands of her husband, and that was for the best. He was not the sort of man who would have love in his life. It was better, far better, to enter into this as an arrangement with an objective and clearly stated expectations. But still, he wished she was plain. Mrs. Evanson. Esme was sitting in the chair beside her bed, reading a book. She had been in the same bed and the same room for weeks now, and she was doing whatever she could for a change of pace. She closed the book as the nurse entered the room. She was holding 2 suitcases. Esme stood to help her, but the nurse waved her off. "I am feeling much better," she said, which was true. The bruises and pain had not disappeared, but they were certainly lessening. "That's all right, Mrs. Evanson. These are yours. Your parents sent them over when they heard your stay would be extended." Esme realized that this must be Carlisle's doing, getting her in-laws to send her clothes from her room. Thank goodness. She didn't have the money to replace her entire wardrobe, let alone while traveling. And although this wasn't a typical marriage, it would still be bad form to wear the same blouse and skirt every day. She had adjusted to the events of yesterday fairly quickly. She had always been able to keep her wits about her when things were tumultuous. Charles would have his third fit of rage in one evening and she would think about what needed to be bought from the grocer the next morning. It kept her calm, to think about the practical elements instead. Now, when the nurse called her Mrs. Evanson, she thought mildly that she would be very glad to change it to Mrs. Cullen. She would be glad to change it to anything else. Mrs. Evanson would be wiped completely away. It felt freeing. Dr. Cullen entered shortly after, though a good deal more harried than he had been the day before. "Good, you have your luggage," he said as he opened the door. "I am glad. I came to tell you that the license has been procured." She nodded. "That's good." "Yes." He nodded, looking a bit awkward. "Tomorrow morning, before we board the train, we can go down to the city hall." "All right." She was positive his hesitation was him wondering if he should tell her it wasn't too late for her to change her mind. She could tell he was unsure if he was making the right decision. If he was worried for her sake, he should NTB. She had agreed with a clear head. She was happy to hold up her end of the bargain, act as a wife to make him seem like a family man, care for his siblings, in exchange for a place where she would be safe, where she had a chance of making some small difference. If he was worried because he was regretting asking her, he very well might be. But there was nothing she could do about that now except try to be of use and forestall his regret. "Excellent. Tomorrow, then." He smiled slightly and left. Esme's first wedding had been modest, but traditional. She had worn a white dress and a veil. She had had high hopes. She had been anticipating a happy ending. For her second wedding, Esme wore her favorite blouse, which was blue and white striped with white embroidery on the collar, a slate gray skirt several years old, and draped her only coat over her arm. She would have worn her Sunday dress, but she was arriving at the town hall only an hour before she would depart with Dr. Cullen on the train, and so traveling clothes were essential. She had privately wondered, too, if it would make her look foolish to wear her Sunday dress to a marriage which was being conducted purely to solve their two problems. To dress too nicely might communicate some hidden expectation that she did not want to communicate. She didn't want Dr. Cullen to think that she thought of their marriage as anything other than what it was. All that was necessary was the signing of the names on the license, and almost before it had begun, they were driving to the train station only a few streets away as husband and wife. It was such an inconsequential process. Esme felt no different afterwards, and certainly not like the wife of the man standing beside her, even after he handed her a gold band to slip on her finger. "I am bringing the car to Washington with us," he told her as he opened her door to help her out. It was the first thing he had said to her since they were married. He stepped away for a moment to speak to a porter, evidently tasked with loading the car onto some other car of the train, and then returned as they proceeded into the station. "It will be useful for going into town, considering the remoteness of the house. Do you know how to drive a car?" "I don't. Charles had one a few years ago, but he sold it before he died. I think he couldn't afford it in the end. And he never thought of me driving." Charles had been gainfully employed at the bank, and they had been fairly well off at the beginning, but hadn't been able to afford much near the end as he started drinking away more of his earnings than ever before. Everything had gone on credit. The house had been sold to pay the debts, she was fairly sure. Robert Evanson had seen to the details of his son's death. She was seeing ever more automobiles on the streets nowadays, but there was still a proliferation of horses and wagons on Main Street. She doubted the town would ever be completely converted to cars. It seemed ludicrous. And so loud. "I can teach you when we get to Washington." He glanced at her. "If you like." She smiled. That would be interesting. One of her father's farmhands had offered her a lesson in driving her father's Fordson tractor, but her mother had gotten wind of it and forbidden the idea. "As I said, the house is very remote, and I may be away at times, dealing with estate matters. I don't want you to feel as though I've trapped you." The sound of the train whistle in the distance made a first wisp of anxiety flicker through Esme, not signing the marriage certificate, but this. It made everything real. She was about to go across the country to a place she had never been with a man she barely knew, who was her husband. She would never see Matilda and Robert again, or the house she had lived in for years. She would never see anything of this town again. She was so glad. The only almost regret she had was that Joseph's grave was here. But what the Evansons had done, taking him away and burying him without her, it made her feel so disconnected to where his body must lay. She was holding him in her heart. "When things are more settled," his voice broke through her thoughts, "I'll send away for a car for you. Or we could buy one in Seattle, if you'd prefer to see it before it arrives." She blinked. "My own car, no, that's, my parents lived miles away from th nearest neighbor. I walked, or I rode, if my father wasn't using the horses. I always managed. A car was a ridiculous investment into a wife that was only for show. She wouldn't ever be able to justify it." His face fell slightly, and she worried she had made a mistake. "I am sorry. It's very kind of you to offer, Dr. Cullen. I only think the expense." Dr. Cullen, his face broke into a smile. "I don't believe you know my given name, Esme." She could feel her face turning red. He was right. "I tried to look at it on the marriage license," she admitted, unable to hide her smile. "But your handwriting was indecipherable." He chuckled. The train, in a rush of noise and steam, pulled into the station. There were only a few passengers boarding here, so many people here rarely left, if ever. He offered her his arm to assist her, and she got onto the train. Esme caught her breath. She had never stepped foot on it before, even though she had heard the piercing whistle for 26 years, far away on the farm of her childhood, closer in the city. She wondered what Matilda and Robert would do when they learned that she had gone. She had discharged herself from the hospital perfectly properly. Everything had been according to procedure, completely above board. There was nothing they could do, she hoped. "My name is Carlyle," he told her as they took their seats across from one another. The train car was otherwise empty. "Carlyle," she repeated, mostly to herself. He grinned at her. "Esme." Esme looked from him to the window next to her as the town she had spent her entire life in began to blur into the past. Her first wedding day had been jittery and hopeful. She had hoped today, too, but somehow, despite everything, she felt completely calm. Maybe it was because she wasn't caught up in some wild, romantic fantasy about true love and a happy life forevermore. The man across from her was kind and responsible and good. Together they would help his siblings. Every minute, she was getting further away from the people who had hurt her. They could build a life together, at least for a few years, that was stable, safe, pleasant, some semblance of a family. There was nothing more she could ask for. The train made another stop after several hours, as dinner was being served. The conductor called out that they were in Indiana, and that Illinois would be next tomorrow. It would take the whole next day to get to Minneapolis, and then nearly 3 more to reach Washington. Carlyle supposed he could thank his father for the train station so near to the town which was otherwise so small and devoid of modern convenience. The shipping business nearness to Port Angeles necessitated it. While the train was stopped, dinner was brought around. He noticed Esme glancing around with some concern. For the past hours they had spoken occasionally, but both of them had something to read, her, My Antonia, him, the latest British medical journal. He supposed there wasn't much use to him reading it now that he had given up his practice, but he didn't think about that. It felt good to maintain some semblance of the familiar routine he was leaving behind in Ohio. Are you all right? I feel as though I should make room, she said with a frown. No one else is going to be able to sit here with my coat on the seat. You don't need to worry about that. This is a private compartment. We're the only ones who will come in here. She bit her lip. Oh, silly of me. It's not. It's just because we'll be here for a few days, and we'll be sleeping. The seat behind you, it will fold down. There's 2 beds, and curtains around them. He hurried to explain the sleeping accommodations, not just because it was almost time to put them to use. He didn't want her to feel as though he was reneging on his promise that everything would be separate, though he thought reserving 2 different cars would be a bit overzealous. She nodded. Are you enjoying the book? He asked, wanting to distract her, and wondering if his guess had been right. She shouldn't be embarrassed. She had probably not ridden many trains in her life. He wondered if she would like traveling. He bet she would. Oh, yes, it's about settler families living out west in Nebraska. A girl and a boy who become friends and grow up together in the countryside. It's very sad, but still beautiful. Her eyes widened slightly. It was at my bedside table at the hospital. I started reading it when I first woke. Now I realize that I've stolen it. I didn't even think of that. I'll post it back when we reach Washington. He laughed. I am sure they would survive without it until then. She was so conscientious. But you don't have to bother. It's yours. She shook her head, and he felt unaccountably flustered to have to explain. When I learned you were in the hospital, I remembered our conversation. From your breaking your leg. Was his face burning? It felt like his face was burning. What was wrong with him? He should have just let her send the book back to the hospital and let a confused nurse open the parcel. The book reminded me of you. I thought you would like something to occupy you. It had been 10 years ago, hadn't it? She probably didn't remember what they had spoken of at all, and he had just revealed she had made such a vibrant impression on him that had never forgotten her. But to his surprise, her face lit up with a smile. I can't believe you remember my rambling about going west and becoming a schoolteacher. You were the only one I ever said it aloud to, because my mother had made it clear I would never be permitted to go. You asked if you could tell me a secret, he said, trying to sound like he didn't remember it as though it were yesterday, even though he did. In the moment he had simply nodded, trying not to be spellbound by the coppery sparks in her brown eyes. And you said that you hadn't really tripped on the steps like your mother said, you'd fallen out of a tree. She said no one could know. She was mortified someone would find out and brand me some kind of harridan. Esme agreed with a giggle that sounded gladder than he had seen her since the hospital. You probably did when I told you. I didn't, he said too quickly. That is, I was impressed. You said that you had climbed up the tree with a book in your teeth because your mother didn't want you reading Madame Bovary. When she found out it was about a woman who had an affair, she said I didn't need to read something that would put such terrible ideas in my head. I told her it wasn't encouraging adultery because Madame Bovary kills herself at the end, but that didn't make her any happier. Esme shook her head, then her smile faded and she looked away. I always liked to read, but I wasn't allowed to spend money on books when I lived with the Evansons, she said. Still, I suppose I wouldn't have had much time for reading. There was always something that needed doing. The way she spoke wasn't even resentful, but resigned, a verbal shrug of the shoulders. He was angry all over again. She had become accustomed to such treatment. She glanced up at him, meeting his eyes, looking slightly brighter. I'd steal Matilda's ladies' magazines, though, and tell her I was washing my hair and read the serials instead. Very resourceful. He never knew when that spark of fire that he had first seen when he treated her leg all those years ago would reappear in her eyes, but he was glad to see it every time. He was surprised it had survived this long. I would do the same when I was a child. Not the serials in ladies' magazines, that is. But I would avoid my father for hours, holed up somewhere with a book. There are woods around our house, and I would hide there. You must have been a very intellectual child. To tell you the truth, I think I just wanted to avoid my father, and I needed something to occupy me while I did that. He smiled slightly. She nodded. He had already told her a little bit of his father's character, but she surely guessed that he had not been the best of men from the situation at hand. You said the last time you saw your brother was when he was a little child. He might as well explain it all to her. Say had married him, after all. It would be good for her to know all of the specifics. My father and I never got along. My mother died shortly after I was born, and he was not equipped to raise a child. His temper made it difficult to retain a governess, so eventually he found a new wife when I was 8 or 9. When the words left his mouth he wondered if Esme noticed any similarity between that man and himself. And there was, wasn't there? He had also just married in order to care for children he felt unable to care for alone. He disliked the thought, and tried to put it out of his mind as he continued. The second Mrs. Cullen was born Elizabeth Masson, from a wealthy timber family, though they had lost much of their fortune in '96 when the banks in Illinois failed. She was a very pleasant woman, though of course completely cowed by my father. She desperately wanted a child of her own, but it didn't happen right away. I was 12 when Edward was born, and I never saw him much, only between school holidays. When I was 17 I left home for college, but I never went back. He wanted me to work under him, and I preferred medical school. I didn't see Edward again after that. I wasn't welcome at my father's home. For a few years, one of his secretaries wrote me about the goings-on, though he was eventually found out and my father fired him. But that was how I learned that Edward's mother died a few years later, when he was 8. There was a diphtheria outbreak in the town. Edward nearly died as well, but eventually recovered. Esme pursed her lips. Tell me about the girls. One of them is ill. Yes, I met Rosalie a few times when she was young. She was born a year after Edward, or a bit sooner, to a woman my father would visit in Seattle when he was there on business. Edward's mother wouldn't have her in the house, obviously. I believe she was raised in a convent school in the city, which is where I met her and her governess when I accompanied my father there a few times. When Edward's mother died, my father brought her into the house, too, I suppose thinking that if Edward was to be raised by a governess, he might as well have her raise both children. Esme nodded, looking thoughtful and not repulsed. That was a good sign. What happened to her mother? She's still alive, as far as I know. Rosalie's mother left the city shortly after Rosalie was born. She had a tendency to form and break attachments to wealthy men quite quickly, but she never had much interest in Rosalie. When Rosalie was young and I still lived with my father, he thought she was in Texas with some oil tycoon, but when I learned of his death, his lawyer said she had been last heard from in Europe. Rosalie was in school in Seattle, too, until this past year when there was some romantic scandal with a tutor which saw her expelled, and my father had her sent to convent school in France. And Mary Alice's mother was a local girl from Forks. He looked away. He had hated his father's womanizing for as long as it had gone on in front of him in his childhood, but he had never felt embarrassed by it until he was recounting the details of his 2 wives and 2 mistresses to Esme. He knew she had been a married woman and had faced more hardship than most despite her youth. She wasn't some naive child, that was what he admired about her and needed in a wife. But he felt regretful to have brought this to her. All of the corruption and heartbreak and misery that his father had caused. Rather sordid origins, I know. Well, the children can't help that, Esme said. At least Rosalie and Edward have grown up together, then. But not Mary Alice. She was born early and sickly. My father told me that Mary Alice's mother threatened to sell her to a teaching hospital, and I do not know if that was true, but she left her with my father regardless. I learned from my father's lawyer that after spending the first 13 years of her life in various hospitals and medical spas with a nurse, Mary Alice was put into a sanitarium for lunatics, which is where she has been since, apparently in adequate physical health. Her mother married at some point, and died just a few years ago. How ghastly, Esme sighed. A life spent in hospitals. Her eyes widened. As a patient, I mean. Carlyle nodded cautiously. Esme's reaction was better than he had expected. When I learned Edward had gone away to boarding school in the city, I wrote him once, but he didn't reply and I regretted it as soon as it was sent. I didn't want my father thinking he had tried to go against his wishes and punishing him on my behalf. So I didn't write again. I wanted to do more for them. All of them. He looked away. What a feeble sentiment. That doesn't really matter, I suppose. What I did was nothing, regardless of what I wished to do. There's nothing you could have done, if your father was determined to keep you away from them. He knew she meant it, but that didn't make him feel any better. He wondered if his father didn't want him around his siblings because he didn't want them to think of any other life than the one he had offered them, full of coldness in a dark house with a man who cared very little for them. But Carlyle had lived in a cold, dim rented room in a boarding house by himself in Ohio, hadn't he, as though part of him had never left Forks and that house. That was why he had planned to stay alone forever, that part of him that had stayed in Forks. Now everything was different. I wonder now if I should have given up my principles and given in to what he wanted for me in return sooner. He would have accepted me, I am sure, if I groveled. He shook his head, but he never would have listened to me even if I was there, I think. Maybe that's just what I tell myself to make up for my selfishness. You've given up your life, Esme said. And your profession, not to mention taken on a wife. She smiled slightly. I don't think that's selfishness. It's not enough, he said, almost without meaning to, then shook his head. I am sorry. Thank you. It's nothing, she said softly. I think I'll go to bed. He nodded. There's a curtain that pulls around too. Change, he said, gesturing to it. Still, his eyes remained, uncomprehending, on the words on the page of his medical journal, even after he heard the scrape of the curtain rings being pulled back, and the sound of her climbing into the bed, curtains tied up. They arrived in Washington 2 uneventful days later. Carlyle brought the car around while Esme waited on the platform. We could go through town, he said as he started the engine. But since you haven't seen the house before, I think we can just go through the road in the woods. It's much quicker if you're on the estate. Most of the forests we'll go through are part of the land. Washington was overcast and cool, even as spring was turning to summer. She had seen some small, distant towns on this last leg of their journey, but everything here was somewhat isolated, a cloud of dark trees proliferating across the landscape as though it wasn't dim enough already from the gray-blue clouds. But the vastness of it, the peace, impressed her. The woods were lovely. The rolling fields of her hometown had always made her feel exposed somehow, but the bustle of the city wasn't any better. It was too noisy and too brutal, buildings hard and sharp-edged, carts and cars and trolleys and people crowding the dusty, uneven streets. This seemed peaceful in a way neither of the places she'd lived before had been. They passed over a wooden bridge to the sound of rushing water. The road was unpaved but wide and well-trodden. The river runs through much of the grounds, Carlyle said. Sometimes the bridge washes out if it rains heavily, so be careful. We'll talk about things like that more when the children get here. And when you get a car. She only smiled. She would convince him later that a car was not worth the expense. They rounded a curve and came upon the house. The way Carlyle had spoken, Esme had been expecting a nice farmhouse, and when he spoke further, she had adjusted her expectations to a very large, nice farmhouse. But what they came upon in the woods was more like a manor. It was large and imposing, dark red brick, with multiple chimneys, narrow, latticed windows, a balcony and sunroom jutting off the front, a large brick archway over the main entrance. It was grand, or rather, she could tell it had been grand at one time. It was obviously being maintained to some degree, but the bricks had a faded quality to them, and there was vegetation untidily growing around the place and up the sides of the house. The windows were dirty and a few of them, she could see, were broken. It looked closed off, without many windows that she could see. She looked to Carlyle, who was pulling around to the covered side building which was probably for either cars or carriages. He grimaced. I thought it would be in worse condition, to be quite honest with you. My father could never keep servants, he was constantly driving them away. But we'll have all the necessary repairs made, and anything you'd like to change, I give you permission. No one is attached to the way things are here. He smiled ruefully. The sound of another car in the distance made them both pause. Is that one of your siblings? Esme asked. Carlyle frowned. Can't be. They're all too far away to have made it here before us. A dark car with mud splattered over the bottom half emerged from the trees and into view from the road leading away from the house. Esme assumed that was the way into town. When the car turned to stop in the paved courtyard at the front of the house, Esme saw that it read Police Patrol on the side. Dr. Cullen, greeted the man who exited the car. I meant to meet you at the station, but the train was earlier than expected. We only just heard the whistle. He closed the distance between them and held out his hand. Charlie Swan. I am Chief of Police. How do you do, Chief Swan, Carlyle said, shaking his hand. This is my wife. Esme smiled at the policeman, though her mind went blank for a moment when Carlyle called her his wife. She hoped she looked composed. Good afternoon. HMPH. Chief Swan seemed a rather terse man. He nodded in response. The late Mr. Cullen's lawyer was called back to Seattle before your arrival. He thought it would be best if the keys to the house were left with us until you got here. He produced a ring of a few keys, which he handed to Carlyle. He paused for a moment as though taking them in. Welcome to Forks, Dr. Cullen, Mrs. Cullen. Or welcome back, I should say. While the two men exchanged a few more pleasantries, Esme turned again to look up at the house. It loomed up darkly above her, but the sight didn't frighten her. If there was light inside, it would look more inviting. It began to rain again, cutting off the conversation between Chief Swan and Carlyle, and he returned to his car while Carlyle hurried ahead of Esme to unlock the large front door, and they went inside. The air smelled strange inside, like distant, stale perfume. The foyer was large, but not opulent. Everything was dark wood and pale wallpaper. She had been right about the scarcity of windows. They were there, but they were narrow and long, put high into the walls so that it was difficult to look out of them. They did not let in much more light than was needed to cast the place in shadows. There was supposed to be at least one maid, said Carlyle behind her, as she walked further into the house. They must have all gone when the lawyer closed up the place. Esme rubbed a finger over the banister. There was some dust, but only enough for a week or so of accumulation. The place wasn't filthy. I'll show you to your room, he said, and then he was leading her up the staircase and down a long hallway. I think for appropriateness' sake, you had better stay in the chambers of the lady of the house. She nodded. That was understandable. He opened the door and gestured for her to go in ahead of him. The room looked faded and old-fashioned, but slightly more cheerful than the rest of the house. There was a large window that opened out to a small balcony, and the wallpaper was beige, lined with green ribbons and tiny red flowers. The same printed fabric curtained the bed, which was dressed with a simple white coverlet with lace trim, and upholstered an armchair near the center of the room. There was a full-length mirror and a chest of drawers, and more than one door leading out. What are your thoughts? Carlyle asked, folding his hands in front of him. Obviously it can all be changed. But for the time being, I like it, she assured him, wandering through the room. It seemed adequately clean. She opened one of the doors and found it was a dressing room with a few discarded chemises and a pile of men's overcoats inside, smelling strongly of mothballs. The other door led to a bathroom, with pale green tiles on the floor, a large white basin sitting against the wall, and a sink, too, so there was water up here. The third door, on the wall that faced the bed, opened to another bedroom. This is your room, she said. Of course they were adjoining. This was a room for a husband and wife. Looking uncomfortable, he nodded. Yes, the room was much the same as hers, but the colored wallpaper and bed hangings were instead a gray-blue, similar to the cloudy sky outside. It was obvious his father had lived here until just 2 weeks before. When he had gone to the hospital he would never return from. There were 2 books stacked on the bedside table alongside a cup, a shirt and tie slung over the back of a chair by the window, shoes laying just in front of the dressing room door. I expected them to be, she said, because he still looked discomfited. He nodded. You're very understanding. Not at all. Esme went to the bed and inspected the dust on the pillows. It looked as though the room had been cleaned regularly, though apparently its last occupant had died 9 years ago, if this was the room Edward's mother had slept in. The pillows needed to be beaten, but nothing was covered in dust. I'll get our bags, said Carlyle, brushing off her offer to help, and then he was gone and Esme was alone for the first time in days. She touched her wedding band gently as she surveyed her surroundings. As Carlyle's steps down the staircase faded from her hearing, she was surrounded by quiet. This was her home now. Everything would really start. The children would arrive, and the days would pass, and she had no idea what was going to happen. Everything might well fall apart. The unfamiliar sight outside the window, a vast forest towering over the house on all sides, green and lush and dripping with rain, made it easier to conceptualize how far she was from Ohio and everything she had ever known. It almost felt like she could leave everything bad there, as though it had never happened to the her that was here. Almost. Carlisle brought their bags up from the car after that, Esme's first, and then his own. Neither of them had much, so it took only 2 trips, but when he returned with his own, he found that Esme had found her way to the kitchen and made tea, which she had left for him on the hall table. There wasn't much in the way of food, he would have to go into town tomorrow for that, likely, but they had eaten on the train, so he didn't bother to look. He took the tea with him upstairs. Her bags were gone from the door where he had left them. She was probably unpacking them inside. He didn't know if he should knock. Make conversation. It was strange to think of himself sleeping in this room, in this bed where his father had slept. He had been nearly 12 when Edward was born, and it was then his father had started impressing upon Carlisle the necessity of following in his footsteps. It became his daily task to read out the printed roll from the stock ticker in his father's study as he shaved and knotted his tie, looking at the reflection in the mirror instead of his son standing behind him. He hadn't cared much for the task because it always ran the risk of displeasing his father. Once when he had read out the news from New York that Tennessee coal shares had dropped precipitously, his father had cursed loudly and struck him in the head so hard Carlisle's whole world had flashed white for a moment. William Cullen had always been inclined to shoot messengers. He had wondered if that uneasy feeling that any moment might turn into pain and violence would persist now that he was here again, in far different circumstances, but it didn't, really. Instead, the room looked very different to him. Smaller. Mundane. It was just a room. His father's clothes were still in the dressing room, but he left them there to deal with later. It was not only his decision, he knew. Perhaps Edward had some preference on what was to be done with their father's personal effects. This was a climate where every man needed a few good overcoats, and it would be a shame to waste them. He had wondered what Edward's feelings would be on their father. He had not been solicitous of the young boy when Carlisle had lived there, but he hadn't been harsh to him. Either. Edward had been Mrs. Cullen's treasure, and she mostly kept him out of her husband's way. He couldn't imagine there would be much fondness for the man. He didn't lend himself to sentiment. But perhaps Edward had a few good memories he'd like to preserve, something to remember the man by. As Carlisle wished for nothing to remember him by, he decided that whatever Edward didn't care to keep, he would bring to the tiny church in town to be distributed. And that was assuming Edward could even use anything. Even if Carlisle had been willing to wear anything of their father's, he doubted he could. He was broader at the shoulders and probably taller, although it was hard to recall because for so much of his childhood the man had seemed impossibly large. He did take the books and drinking glass by the bed and the shoes by the door away and put them all aside in the dressing room. He put the shaving kit on the counter in the bathroom there, too, and the full snuff box in the nightstand drawer. He opened his suitcase and retrieved his mother's Bible, the one calligraphed with her maiden name on the inside cover, and put it on the nightstand instead, which gave him a small measure of satisfaction. He had taken it from the library when he left for college, without asking, of course, but he didn't think his father had missed it. He had never known his mother, so he could not attribute any sentimental value to it, but he had liked reminding himself of the idea that he wasn't solely the product of his father. With this now satisfied, his attention fell to the adjoining door. Esme had assumed his hesitation was for her sake, and he had worried it would discomfort her, but he had been thinking of himself, really. He couldn't help but be extremely aware of the beautiful woman on the other side of the door. He wondered if she would lock it, or if he should, to demonstrate that he would not renege on their terms. He raised his hand, but then dropped it again. He would do nothing, because he didn't need a lock on a door. He wondered if Elizabeth Masson or his own mother had ever locked the door. He doubted his father would have liked that. He had never seen Mrs. Cullen in his father's room, not once in the years that she had lived with him. He doubted she ever spent much time there. He heard a distant sound of water running, and the quiet rush of the pipes which had probably sat unused for a very long time. It was the bath, certainly, so he thought she must be going to bed. In spite of himself he wondered what Esme's nightgowns looked like. You are more like him than you like to think, he thought bitterly to himself. That is not why you brought her here. No, he had brought her here to get her out of Ohio, away from those who would harm her. And to make him a married man fit to welcome a family into this house. The first was mostly accomplished, although keeping Esme in safety and security would be an ongoing task, perhaps forever if she did not tire of him before then. The second was just beginning. Edward would arrive tomorrow from his school in Seattle. The last time they had spoken, over a decade ago, Edward had barely been old enough for the schoolroom. He knew it was foolhardy to even think about it. He knew Edward was a stranger to him, and so were his sisters, that experiencing their father could not have been pleasant, that the circumstances of his return to Forks were gloomy. And yet something in him had always wondered if one day, despite everything that had happened, there was a possibility of living life not alone. Now it had come to pass, and he wasn't sure if he was more hopeful or apprehensive. Selfish of him to want people around him when he knew they shouldn't be subjected to him. Wouldn't the darkness of his person bleed out onto those around him and infect them like a Midas touch? He would not let that happen. He would do right by Esme, by Edward, Rosalie, and Mary Alice. He had to. Carlyle woke early that morning, dressed quickly, and proceeded to his father's study. Doubtless there were ledgers to look over, correspondence to familiarize himself with, and things he wished to get rid of. He would go down to his father's office in town soon, but he was dragging his feet. His office, and his study now, he thought to himself. It was a strange idea. He glanced through a few notes of recent shipments, but didn't study them long before he went to the kitchen, hoping to return the favor Esme had done last night and make tea for them both. He was surprised to find she was already there, not dressed to travel for the first time since they had married, wearing a light pink printed dress with long sleeves, a sash, and a wide white collar. Her hair was pulled back in a loose coil at the back of her head, with a black ribbon threaded through. She had looked better ever since they got on the train, though whether it was because the last, lingering injuries were faded away or because she was gone from the place she had suffered, he didn't know. She certainly looked more rested. "Good morning. Do you drink coffee?" "Not religiously. There was tea already out." "Thank you." She gestured to the Kelvinator. There were groceries delivered this morning to the kitchen door. The boy who brought them said it was standard for the last year, it was on credit with the grocer in town. "I would have brought you to talk to him, but I wasn't sure where you were." She spoke casually, but he wondered if she was annoyed. Had she knocked on his door? Had she opened the adjoining one? "I am sorry for abandoning you," he said with a smile, wanting to keep things light. "I was looking over some of my father's papers. I didn't realize you'd wake so early. I wanted to have time to go to town to shop, but it ended up that I didn't need to. I thought I would make a cake." "Edward is still expected today." There was a note of anxiousness in her voice at the last part, but she was smiling. He nodded. "I haven't heard anything different. And it will be the three of us for some time. Rosalie's been sent for, but she has to cross the ocean, and Mary Alice is in Florida and there are no direct routes by train. But you don't need to cook for us. I'll go into town, find out whoever my father had employed here before he died, or find someone new." "There's no need to do that today," she said. "You'll need to get Edward from the station anyhow. Do you like eggs?" "I can make us eggs," he said, rising and going to the Kelvinator. "But I am already making eggs," she said in a pleasant tone which still left no room for argument. "If you really want to be helpful, you can locate the woodbox and get some more kindling for the stove." He did as she asked. He felt like he was outside of himself, watching himself watch the scene, his wife making him breakfast. There was an element of absurdity to it. He had never imagined himself not alone. She made the eggs quickly and without conversation, but when she put them on a plate she sat down across from him at the kitchen table. He was somewhat relieved she wanted to eat with him. "Delicious," he said. "They're eggs," she replied dryly. Now that she was sitting closer he noticed that her pink dress was actually a faded red. "And they need salt, but I can't find the salt cellar." "But thank you. What are you going to do, Tota?" "I'd better go back to the study, try to understand what was happening with my father's business before he died. I'll need to figure out what to do with it all." He hoped she didn't hear the dread in his voice. He was being dramatic. "What will you do?" "Well, I'll make a cake." She sipped her tea. "Maybe explore the house a bit. It would be embarrassing to get lost again when Edward is here." "Did you get lost this morning?" Her mouth twitched. "I went down the stairs the wrong way and then I had no chance of retracing my steps. I found the kitchen last night so easily, too. But today the only way I could turn myself around was when I heard the grocer's boy pounding on the servant entrance and moved towards the sound." He couldn't help but smile. "I am sure you'll navigate easily in no time at all." She nodded thoughtfully. "I hope so. It isn't even that there are so many rooms, it's manageable, it's that all the walls look the same." "Did it look like this when you lived here?" "Exactly like this. My father wasn't much for decoration. My grandfather built the house, and my father built onto it, The exterior is there to impress people, to communicate what a successful businessman he's been. But the only people on the inside were his family. No one who needed a good impression. He looked back at her. Remember, I told you that anything that you want to change, you can. Not just your room, anywhere in the house. He had decided before that it was her right as lady of the house, but now something in him foolishly hoped she would change things. He wanted to look at walls papered with a pattern she had chosen and think of her. He wanted to see the furniture, the artwork, every furnishing and know it was there because it had come from her vision. Then perhaps this house wouldn't feel like a tomb of bleak, fearful memories. Good Lord, he was becoming very ridiculous. I'll keep that in mind. She rose, taking her plate to the sink. He stood as well. Please do. The study is next to my bedroom, if you need me. He crossed the room to a cabinet above the sink basin where he vaguely remembered spices were kept. There was a silver salt cellar on the top shelf, and he set it on the counter. And here's the salt, if you need it again. She raised her eyebrows. Thank you. Things must not have changed very much around here since you were here last. No, they haven't, he agreed. But they would change now. Esme was technically not lying when she said she was going to explore the house. She was just exploring with a purpose. The purpose was to tally up broken windows, crumbling trim, dusty furniture, and other parts of the house that needed to be cleaned or repaired. The cleaning she could do herself today. The repairs she would leave for later, at least until she found a hammer and nails. She hadn't been transparent because she had already gleaned that Carlisle would object to her cleaning the house. But she didn't exactly want a maid here at the moment. Edward was coming today, and he would already meet two strangers. She didn't personally want a maid in the house either, after what happened when she was married to Charles. But she didn't want to think about that now. She wondered if that was what had happened with the mother of the youngest girl, Mary Alice. Carlisle had said her mother was a local girl and that his father had trouble keeping staff. If he was interfering with the household girls, most families would be reluctant to send their daughters to work there. She had been thinking of the children constantly, and even more now that she knew she would meet Edward today. She knew very little and wondered very much. She found the linen closet and redid the bed in the room she had ascertained, by the men's clothes in the closet, as Edward's, beating the dust out of the mattress and opening the windows to air out the stale rooms. Perhaps her room had been cleaned more thoroughly because it was adjoined to the master, where Carlisle's father had slept until a few weeks ago. It had been very odd to think of him sleeping just on the other side of the wall last night. He had been much farther away than on the train, where the curtained traveling bunk had been just across the tiny car. But somehow that had seemed more separated. Esme snapped the sheet she was laying down with more force than necessary. She wasn't going to do this. Certainly she liked him very much. Certainly he was handsome and good-humored, and more than that he was so kind to her and to the world at large, in a way she had forgotten people could be. But she was more sensible than that. They had an agreement. How many nights had she lay in bed with Charles beside her, usually snoring, reeking of drink, and wished she was alone, wished she'd never have to feel vise-like arms around her again, taste sour lips on her mouth. She shuddered involuntarily at the memory. If Carlisle had wanted all of those things, if he was searching for a real wife and not a convenient one, he would have chosen someone else. Someone who he hadn't met in a hospital after she threw herself off a cliff, certainly. Someone sophisticated and undamaged. It took longer than she thought to find all of the problems in the house, a leak in the library that would need more than the bucket she had placed under it, the peeling wallpaper in the fourth bedroom, the burnt-out electric lights in the sitting room, so by noon she hurried to start on the cake. The groceries that had been delivered were simple, basic necessities one might need for the week, and encompassed everything she needed for her recipe: butter, eggs, sugar, flour, milk, baking soda, and salt from the cellar Carlisle had found that morning. If there had been chocolate she would have added some, but there had been none delivered, so she added vanilla already in the cabinet. When she found out she was pregnant, she had thought one day she would bake a cake like this for Joseph's birthdays. She pushed the thought away, not wanting to be gloomy. She should focus on the fact that Edward would arrive today. She was going to be cheerful, but she wasn't stupid. After everything that Carlisle had told her, she didn't anticipate a warm and happy homecoming. That wasn't why she said yes. After all, it was because the children sounded hurt and in need of love and understanding. And she was here in the world with no one else to love, and she knew what it was like to be rejected and lonely and miserable, so why shouldn't she try to help them with anything that she had? She whipped some cream to top the cake and felt a twinge in her shoulder which made her think she should be more careful despite how much better she had felt these past days. She put the cake in the icebox, and then started on supper. The groceries she had didn't allow for anything fanciful, but she wouldn't have wanted that anyway. She chopped potatoes more carefully than she had whipped the cream, and boiled them while the trout cooked in the oven, realizing she would have to have more groceries brought tomorrow or the next day, or go herself. This order was for one man for the week, but it wouldn't feed 3 for that long. It would be interesting to go into town. She wondered what people would think of her. The Cullen family was the lifeblood of this place, apparently, and there had not been a Mrs. Cullen in quite some time. It was late afternoon when Carlyle appeared in the doorway, dressed to go out. "The train should be here soon. I'll fetch him and be right back." "I look forward to it," Esme said with a smile she hoped was encouraging. Carlyle had a rather severe expression and she was sure he must be somewhat nervous. After he left she put the kettle back on. It was drizzling outside. She hoped Edward had worn his raincoat on the train. If he had grown up here, he would know to do so, wouldn't he? She wondered if Carlyle had taken an umbrella. She wondered if Edward resembled his brother, if he was quiet and gracious like him or ostentatious and showy like wealthy teenage boys in Columbus she had seen speeding through the streets, a dozen all piled into an open-top car, honking and whistling at the girls who went by. She wondered if Edward had missed Carlyle these 10 years of absence. She wondered if he missed his father. It was less than an hour until the front door opened again, and Esme stepped into the foyer, trying to quiet the anxious feeling that rose up in her. The two men were divesting themselves of raincoats and their hats, Carlyle and a tall, sandy-haired boy with a solemn expression, certainly Edward, though there wasn't much resemblance to his elder brother. Carlyle smiled at her, but she detected some strain behind his eyes. It was obvious there had been no joyous reunion between the brothers. "Esme, this is my brother Edward. Edward, this is my wife." "It's very good to meet you, Edward," Esme said. Like Carlyle, he was shockingly handsome, though there was little similar in the angles of their jaws or the lines of their noses to advertise brotherhood. Despite that, his appearance was more unassuming than Dudish, as she had speculated he might look. His dark blonde hair curled slightly and looked a bit untidy, and he wore a dark coat open to a brown knit pullover. They were well made, but plain clothes. Edward shook her hand half-heartedly, setting down the suitcase he was holding to do so. "Mrs. Cullen. You can call me Esme," she offered with a smile, though she realized that she enjoyed being called Mrs. Cullen. It reminded her that she was not Mrs. Evanson anymore. Charles didn't even exist to her anymore. "I was sorry to hear of your father's passing. Your brother has spoken very highly of you." "Has he?" A sardonic shadow of a smile crossed Edward's face as he glanced at Carlyle, who didn't look pleased. He did not address her comment about his father. "I'll retire to my room, I think." "Of course. I am sure you've been traveling all day in this rain," Esme said. "But I'd be very pleased if you joined us for supper in a half-hour." Edward nodded and went upstairs. Carlyle watched him go and only looked at Esme when the younger boy had disappeared from view. She smiled at him. He looked tired. "I think I'd better go dry off, too," he said. He stood there for a moment like he was going to say more, but then turned and went up the stairs in the opposite direction as Edward. Esme was left in the foyer by herself, and decided to go into the dining room and set the table. The dining room was as dark and imposing as the rest of the house. Dark wood panels lined the walls, and there was a large fireplace against one wall. There was a large painting of a mountain landscape at dusk over the mantel, but no little knickknacks or vases, nor any other decorations on the walls. There was a cabinet on the opposite wall, and the same windows as the rest of the house, narrow and high-set, flanked by heavy burgundy curtains. The room had electric lamps, but the space still felt dark and cavernous, so Esme lit a lamp for the table as well. Carlyle returned to the dining room sooner than she had thought he would. Esme couldn't deny she was pleased to see the surprise on his face when he entered. "I thought you were going to make eggs. You already had eggs today. And I am happy to have them until we engage another maid." The dining table was massive, but she had only set one end the head of the table and the two places on either side. "You know, I didn't bring you from Ohio to cook and clean. I don't want to give you that impression." "I know," she cut herself off. "Hello, Edward, I hope you like trout." They hadn't actually spoken about it, but she knew instinctively that Carlyle's siblings should not be told of their arrangement. It would be difficult to explain. She doubted they would appreciate the fact that their brother didn't want them to be split between 3 previously uncaring sets of distant relatives. Besides, what would they think of her? She wondered. If they knew, they would want to know why she had agreed to it, and what would she tell them? She had had nowhere else to go after she failed to kill herself. Then again, Carlyle was a handsome, charming doctor. There were many women who might agree to such an arrangement just on the strength of that. Did he know that he must? Another mystery of why he had asked her. Edward didn't meet her eyes. That's very kind of you. You're quite welcome. Esme sat across from him, Carlyle in the middle. A long silence stretched over the table. Esme didn't want to be the first to speak, aware that while they were all essentially strangers to one another, she was even more of an outsider. She wouldn't jabber on about some silly nonsense just to fill the quiet that wouldn't accomplish anything in improving relations between the brothers. I didn't know you got married, Edward finally said to Carlyle. Esme heard the weight of the understatement. Of course Edward did not know his brother was married. The two knew nothing of one another. It was almost an absurd thing to say, which she was sure was his point. I only did quite recently. This year, said Carlyle, technically not lying. Esme was glad that he wasn't trying to make sentimental conversation constantly. She could tell Edward didn't have the patience for that. Nevertheless, the atmosphere was one of discomfort. Edward shook his head slightly, as if he couldn't understand Carlyle's idiocy. Why would you bring her here? Esme pressed her lips together. Carlyle frowned sharply. What are you talking about? He didn't turn to look at her, but he placed his hand on the arm of her chair, as though to shield her. Esme wasn't insulted, though. She didn't think it was herself Edward was angry with. Why would you make someone come to this place if they didn't have to? Edward asked, quiet but accusatory. He looked up from his plate, and Esme could see his eyes were burning with pain. Why did you even come back at all? I would have come back sooner if it wasn't for William disallowing it, Carlyle said calmly. Horsesh, Edward glanced at Esme and stifled his swear. You wouldn't have. I don't expect you to believe me. I know you have no. Carlyle's voice, unlike Edward's, was totally devoid of anger. He sounded more regretful than anything. It doesn't matter, Edward interrupted, staring down at his food. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scraping of plates on forks. Esme wanted to say something to break the tension, but she doubted there were any words that could do that. Have you given any thought to college yet? Edward, Carlyle said finally, in a neutral tone. Edward grimaced, as if speaking to the man was physically painful. Father wanted Wharton. Carlyle nodded, glancing at her. He was always very focused on the prestige of a university. He didn't like to be reminded he took no degree from either of his colleges, for lasting barely a year at each. Edward raised his eyebrows slightly in an expression of sarcastic agreement. For a moment the tenseness in the room faded slightly as both brothers united in their dislike of their father. She couldn't help but smile. Did you find what you were looking for in the study today? She asked Carlyle, wanting to continue the less stifled conversation. He nodded. Mostly. I know I'll have to go into the offices this week. I suppose it's because my preferences lay elsewhere, but I don't look forward to the visit. Isn't there any way you can practice medicine in town? Esme sighed. That is, I am sure there aren't any doctors with your talent there already if the town is as small as you say. He smiled slightly. You're very kind. You're right that there isn't much of a medical presence here. If anyone needed anything done they would go to Seattle or one of the bigger towns on the way. But there would be the question of the Cullen business ventures. Not just because of the family fortune, the shipping and the mines employ most of the town one way or the other. Are there not managers and stewards who can oversee these things for you, at least partially? Esme asked. Do you even have the aptitude for business? She immediately realized how rude her question sounded and regretted her words, but a smile broke across Carlyle's face and Edward's mouth twitched as well. I suppose I don't know. Carlyle looked at Edward. Edward, if you would like any involvement, now or in the future, I'd welcome it. The warmth of the atmosphere suddenly disintegrated as Edward looked up at Carlyle with a flat expression. Do we have to do this? What do you mean? Carlyle frowned. Edward tensed. We don't have to pretend to be some sort of, I don't know. Family. We're here because we have to be, or at least I am. I don't know why you're here, but that's your choice. But what's the use in acting like we have anything to say to each other? Edward. Carlyle stood as Edward did. Edward walked to the doorway, but turned back when he got there. His gaze was dark when he looked at Carlyle, and he spat his words like venom. Is this because you knew how he was when you left? Carlyle, I know he beat you too. More than once I thought he would kill you. If you're trying to absolve your guilt by play acting as a family, that is your problem. I don't see why I need to take part. Carlisle fell silent as Edward disappeared into the hallway. Esme's blood ran cold. It wasn't surprising, the idea that William had beat his children, considering the circumstances and what she had thus far heard of his character. Of course, few parents were above a switching or a spanking at times, especially out in the country where she was from. But the way Edward spoke made her sure this had been far more severe. Everything remained silent and still for a long moment. She didn't know what to do or say. Carlisle sat back down as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. "I am a fool," he said softly. "You're not," Esme said. She almost reached for his hand, but then she thought better of it. "You're not. He never lay a hand on Edward when I was here," he murmured, staring at nothing. "I thought it was because that it was me. I was the eldest and bore all the expectations. He never touched Edward," he repeated again, almost to himself. "I thought it was me. The only one at fault is your father," Esme said, and hoped he believed it. "Over time it faded, because I learned to avoid him and I was becoming able to defend myself. I suppose I thought that he was finished with it." He shut his eyes. "But of course he turned on Edward. I had gone and his mother was dead. I am a fool." "It's impossible to think rationally about these things when you're a part of them," Esme said quietly. Carlisle's gaze was far away, and she wasn't sure if he even heard her. But she knew it well enough. For nearly a year she had been sure that every time Charles struck her it would be the last time. That she would do everything right from now on as long as she didn't whistle anymore, or have dinner late, or open the curtains too early on a Sunday morning. She wasn't happy about it. She knew he shouldn't do it. But she had been trying to make the best of things. She couldn't control him, but she could control herself, and if she did everything right she could still eke out something resembling an all-right life. Part of her still thought that if he'd married another woman he wouldn't have hit her. Foolish, like Carlisle had said. She stared at the flickering flames of the gas lamp on the table. "I rarely thought of it. Wondered why he was like that. I mean, he simply was, and I had to live around it." "You're right, irrational." He shook his head slightly, and turned to look at her. "I am sorry you had to witness that, or any other arguing or outbursts. None of it is your fault. But I cannot blame Edward for hating me. Nor the girls, if they do too." "He doesn't hate you," she said. "He doesn't know you, and he's miserable, and he's an orphan, and he's 17. None of that means he hates you." He exhaled, an approximation of a laugh but without humor. "That's comforting to hear." She didn't see how anyone could ever hate Carlisle. She understood, to the extent she could, Edward's anger and pain. Him perhaps even more than the others, because he had known Carlisle as a young child. She was sure they had loved one another then, if Carlisle was a fraction of the man he was currently. And then he had gone with no explanation, and then his mother had died, and then his father had been cruel to him as he had used to be to Carlisle. Now, nearly 10 years later, they were back together again, the father who had treated them both badly gone, everything between them raw and unspoken. Perhaps Edward didn't believe that Carlisle's ignorance was genuine, but Esme couldn't think otherwise. His face had gone ashen when Edward had said, "He beat you, too." It was obvious that he was shattered by the revelation. Her heart broke for Edward, who must have felt so abandoned and been so maltreated. Her heart broke for Carlisle, who had endured cruelty at the hands of the man meant to raise him, and he had always been certain it was due to some personal defect of his, not an inclination of his father to violence against his children. "We didn't have cake," Esme noted softly, standing up and reaching for plates. Carlisle stood, too, despite her protest, to assist her in cleaning up. Once the plates were away, they didn't move back to the dining room, and Esme cut them both pieces of cake to eat around the kitchen table. She had made coffee earlier, planning to offer it with dessert, and now she poured them both some. They were quiet for a while, but she could tell Carlisle was still thinking about what had happened and she wanted to take his mind off of it. "I noticed today that there was a leak in the library ceiling," she said. "And a few other places are in need of repair. I should have known not to trust you when you said you would be exploring," he complained. "You know, you should be resting as your injuries finish healing." They have. That was mostly true. She wondered if some of the bruises would never fully fade, but the pain of sitting or turning her head was almost entirely gone, with just a lingering remnant to remind her that just months ago she had leapt off a cliff, hoping to die. Now she was across the country without a word to anyone who knew her. She was the wife of the man across from her. She had taken on the task of caring for his 3 teenage siblings, and what a task that would be, if tonight was anything to go by. Will you please at least sleep late tomorrow or sit and read, finish my Antonia. Carlyle was smiling, but his eyes told her he was serious. Unless he was obviously joking, he always seemed to say things straight out. Charles hadn't been like that even when he was trying to get along with her. He couched all of his criticisms in roundabout ways. Most men wouldn't be so nice about their wives nagging them constantly. I am glad you're not wearing the yellow dress you wore last week, it made you look ridiculous. Robert's wife has a talent for thrift. She costs him half of what you cost me. Do you think that's funny, you stupid bitch? She pushed the thoughts away with force, before they caught her up and bore her away on a tide of fear and pain. Charles was dead. She had a new husband now. He hadn't hurt her yet. He didn't get angry like Charles. Perhaps he really never did. Still, she should push it. I promise I'll take some time to read tomorrow, she said. I only had so much to do today because I wanted to make Edward's room livable. It doesn't sound like they get along, Carlyle mused. Edward and Rosalie. I know she began to live with them after Edward's mother died, but that was nearly 10 years ago now. You said she changed schools last year, Esme asked, remembering his words on the train. Something about a teacher. Yes, there was some romantic scandal with a tutor of some sort last semester, in the fall. She was expelled. My father had her sent to a French convent school for this spring, despite his distaste for Catholics. Where will they go next year? Is there a school here? Maybe she should be thinking ahead to the end of summer, but it was a practical matter. She might be here for the rest of her life. It was an enormous thought, but not a frightening one. If things kept going like this, that would be all right. She would be happy. Of course, it had only been a few days. Anything might happen. A small public school in town. Edward and Rosalie will be fine there. If their university aspirations demand it, they can have a last year at preparatory school. I don't know how much education Mary Alice has had. She may need to be kept at home. I suppose I could engage a tutor, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Carlyle looked at her, a touch of anxiousness in his expression. What did you think of Edward the first? He seemed all right, didn't he? He seemed to be in good health, Esme said, unsure of what he meant, exactly. He's a bit pale, but if he lives here that's not a surprise. Now Carlyle looked embarrassed, running a hand through his hair. Did you like him? I suppose you don't know him well enough to. I suppose I don't, either. The last time I saw him he was just a child. But Esme relieved him of his struggle to express his feelings. She was fairly certain she understood what he meant. He's still your brother, even if you haven't seen him in a long time. That doesn't mean you don't love him. You'll just have to get to know the man he's become, and remind him of who you are. She smiled. But yes, I did like him. He was very polite about my cooking, especially considering I am a stranger living in his house. I am the stranger, Carlyle said softly. You're an angel living in the house. I am not, she said, glancing away from him. She wasn't used to gratitude. It made her feel uncomfortable somehow. She didn't deserve it, and she didn't know how to respond to it. What a fool she was. What a stupid problem to have. As though there wasn't a myriad of women from here to Ohio who'd be perfectly happy to listen to Dr. Carlyle Cullen call them angels. The smile on his face when he looked at her was so fond it made her heart ache. It wasn't just the fact that he was exquisitely handsome, the look in her eyes was as though he really saw her. As though he was glad she was here. She could barely understand it. Of course, he was also exquisitely handsome. His gold hair was slightly untidy from where he had run his hand through it, giving him a disarmingly boyish look. Sometimes he looked untouchable, like a fairy tale prince or a marble statue. Esme wondered if she didn't prefer that. It seemed safer. You're too kind, she said quietly, suddenly wanting distance between them. She didn't want to look at him anymore. She didn't want to feel anything about him right now, it was dangerous. You know, I might go to bed. It's getting late. It wasn't that late, just past 8, but Carlyle nodded, standing up when she did and taking the plate she reached for before she could to put it in the basin of the sink. Do you promise not to clean tomorrow? He said lightly as he turned back to her. She could tell he was not being too serious. I promise to read for a bit. I won't waive my right to clean a bit if something needs cleaning. She ignored the disapproval on his face. That's as much as you'll get out of me, so you had better take it. Good night. He half smiled at that. Good night, Esme. He didn't follow her upstairs. She wasn't sure how long he stayed away, but it wasn't until she was already in bed that she heard the door to the adjoining room open. She had left her curtains open. The moon was bright, stark white against the dark sky and framed by the crowded black treetops that surrounded the house. A charcoal-colored cloud drifted in front of it, but Esme could still see it shining fuzzily through the darkness like a faraway pearl. She didn't even remember falling asleep. Esme was too accustomed to rising early to sleep in, no matter what Carlisle said. Besides, she didn't know when he and Edward would rise, and she wanted to have coffee and tea and breakfast ready. When she got into the kitchen, though, Carlisle was already there, and he was cooking bacon. She could tell he wasn't staying long, though. There was a dark suit jacket and overcoat draped over a kitchen chair. He was in shirt sleeves and suspenders as he stood by the stove, and when he turned to greet her, she saw he was wearing a tie. "Good morning," he said. "I would have done that," she replied, hurrying to put the kettle and the coffee on. She glanced over her shoulder and back at him before she could stop herself. She had always gone to bed before him on the train, and stayed in her curtained bunk until she was sure he had already risen and dressed in the mornings. He had mostly worn a pullover and buttoned shirt when traveling, so he wasn't wearing any less than usual, but the suspenders and rolled sleeves, the obvious absence of a suit jacket, looked disarmingly informal. "We're nearly out of eggs," he said. "I'll adjust the grocery order while I am out. You should write down anything you'd like. You're going into town." She would make toast. She decided she had discovered yesterday there was no electric toaster, so she stuck 2 slices of bread on the toasting fork and began to brown them over the small hearth fire. "Yes, I'll be gone for much of the day, most likely, if you'll be all right by yourself." "I won't be alone," she answered. "Edward will be here." "Yes, but I am not sure how much company he will be." That was true, but she wasn't going to force him to socialize with her. That wouldn't do either of them any good. "I liked to be alone when I was that age. I would finish all my chores as quickly as possible so I could hide up in the hayloft in the barn and not go into the house for an hour or 2 more. She chuckled. "I rather soured on tree climbing after, you know." "What did you do up there?" he asked with a smile. She placed the toast on a plate and took up 2 more slices of bread to cook. "Oh, reading books I wasn't supposed to, sketching the barn cats and their kittens, just thinking, daydreaming, sometimes. I just like to be alone with my thoughts." "You like to draw?" He lifted his head to meet her eyes, and she glanced away. When I was a teenager I did. Not in a long time." It made her feel awkward and self-indulgent to mention it. She had loved to sketch then, and sometimes when she was writing a list or a letter the impulse was still there, but whatever skill she had once possessed had been neglected too long and had withered away. "I used to be the same way," he noted into the awkward silence that followed her deflection. "I think solitude can be rather difficult, though. That is, when you're alone for too long, it becomes stale and lonely, and yet the longer it goes on the less you're able to remedy it." His tone was light, but she knew he had to be speaking of himself. Of course he had not seen any of his family for over a decade, but Esme had not imagined that Carlisle's personal life was so solitary as well. "Why were you alone?" He turned the frying pan over to drop the bacon onto a plate, and went to the kitchen table. Esme poured him some tea. "I suppose because of the volatility of emotional attachment. The avoidance of such things is a strength as a doctor, but not as a person." She nodded, reminding herself that even though this was her husband across from her in his shirt sleeves, and they were sitting at the kitchen table eating toast she had made and bacon he had fried, these sort of pleasant, getting along interactions were all that would ever be between them. Maybe, hopefully, friendship and camaraderie one day, but nothing more. And that was fine. That was what she had wanted. "That does sound lonely," she agreed. She had always wished to be alone when she was with Charles and his parents, but she had never really wanted to be by herself. She had just wanted them to stop hurting her. Mentally, she had always been alone when she was with them, her ideas and her dreams withering inside her. It was so different with Carlisle, even for the short time she had known him. She went to sleep alone every night, but they had spoken about so much. He had asked her what she thought so many times. She couldn't remember a single time Charles had asked her what she thought. "Do you think that's funny, you stupid bitch?" "I suppose that isn't the case anymore," he said quietly, and when she looked up from her tea their eyes met. "I am glad not to be alone anymore." "Me too." She couldn't stop herself from saying it, but she regretted it and looked away. "I'll write you a list for groceries if it isn't any trouble." She got up and found a pencil and paper, busying herself with her writing. "Thank you," he said and she handed him the hastily written list. "Is there anything else I can get for you in town?" "I'll inquire about the maids, too." "You don't need to do that," she replied quickly. There don't need to be more strangers in this house than there already are right now. Maybe when things are more settled, if you feel so strongly. I do feel strongly, he agreed, one side of his mouth curling into a smile that made her glance away, flustered. But I will do as you ask. Have a good day, she offered as he left, and when she was alone in the kitchen again she couldn't help but think about how this was perhaps the pleasantest morning she'd ever had. Certainly the pleasantest since she had married Charles. For a moment she stared at the empty dishes, noticed the smell of toast lingering in the air, and pretended like she had everything she ever wanted. Her husband who loved her and respected her had just left for work. Her baby was in a cradle just in the corner of her eye, and if she turned her head she would see him and smile. Joseph would be 3 months old in a few days. Would have been 3 months old, rather. She felt very melancholy at how long had been gone from her already, and every day brought her further away from the last time she'd held him in her arms. But every day was a day she could love him, she reminded herself, and fortunately, tears didn't come to her eyes as easily as they had before. It was comforting in a way, to know that as long as she was alive, her baby would be loved. She would be here, loving him like she had just held him, until she left this life. And even on her 3rd day of living here, she had so much more than she could want. She wasn't sure if she could call herself and Carlisle friends yet, but she wanted to. He liked her and she liked him. They had joked together, and helped one another, and he was so kind to her. That was more than her wildest dream, to have a husband like that. Of course, once she had dreamed of a husband who loved her, but that had been given up even before Charles. She couldn't bring herself to regret this arrangement. Wishing for love on top of everything seemed embarrassing greedy, considering how improved her situation was. She took a breath and cleaned up breakfast, leaving the remaining food on the table. More likely than not Edward would creep down like a forest animal when he thought no one was around to take something, and she didn't want him to go hungry. Part of her wanted to bring a plate to his room, but she didn't want to bother him before he was ready. She lingered in the kitchen for a little while, deciding what they would eat for supper tonight from what they still had for groceries. She didn't want to depend on what she had asked Carlisle to get. She wasn't sure when he'd be back. She hoped soon, but that was just because she wanted to see him again. She didn't think too much more about that impulse. She did a bit more surveying of the house, this time mostly the servants' quarters, which were more extensive than she had expected, 4 rooms which could have each slept 2 or 4, if one was of an enterprising turn of mind and didn't care for the comfort of their chambermaids, and a housekeeper's room with a sitting room attached. There was a larder, unimpressively stocked, but she was glad to know it was there, and a closet of silver and china. She followed the servants' entrance to the outside. She hadn't gone outside at all yesterday, she realized, except onto the balcony and to open the door for the grocer, and found herself on the side of the house with the carriage house. She walked around to the back of the house. There was no garden or landscaping to speak of, which was slightly disappointing, but maybe should this arrangement continue she could change that. The house was surrounded on all sides by trees, although it was obvious they had been planted after construction, with the 3 stories far taller than the nearest trees. Further away, though, the trees were so tall they plunged the house into shade, even without the cloudiness of the sky. Around noon, not wanting to really upset Carlisle, Esme left off her exploring and her planning. She went to the library to finish her book and, admittedly, to further inspect the leak. The library was on the left wing of the house, on the 2nd floor. In the hallway, a very faint noise filtered into her hearing. She concentrated, and realized it wasn't noise, but a piano. She had never seen a piano in the house. It was coming from somewhere nearby. Carefully, trying to keep the floor from creaking too much and drowning out the sound, she stepped cautiously forward and back, trying to go where the sound was loudest. Several minutes of this ended with her on the 3rd floor, standing in front of the closed door to a sitting room, the dark wood door muffling the uninterrupted melody behind it. It occurred to her this was almost a Gothic novel. On her own in a big, dark manor in the big, dark forest, hearing a melancholy piano she could have sworn didn't exist before smiling wryly at her thought, she carefully opened the door, glad it didn't squeak. It was Edward. His back was to her as he sat at the piano she hadn't seen before. She hadn't gone too far inside this room yesterday, she had been more focused on making ready his bedroom, and the curtains had been drawn, obscuring the piano from sight. Now they were open, and the room was a bit brighter. The tune he was playing sounded somewhat familiar, but she couldn't have named it. He played beautifully, though, even to her untrained ear, one hand traveling slowly up and then down the high end of the keys, the other playing a flowing undercurrent of the melody. She hadn't heard anything so pretty except on a record, and even then, there was something about being in the same room as the musician which added a certain depth to the song. The tune stopped jarringly, and Edward half turned to look at her, a guarded expression on his face. Esme froze, regretting her intrusion. She had been trying to give him a wide berth. "I am sorry," she said, taking a step backwards towards the door. "I heard the music and I thought you were a ghost." She had been trying to be a little funny, but she hadn't expected Edward to actually smile slightly at her words. A downcast smile, but a smile nonetheless. "You play very beautifully. Not that I know much about music, but I am sure I've heard that song before. Not like this, though." Edward turned back to the piano, and began to play again, and for a moment Esme thought it was his way of dismissing her, until he said, so low she had to strain to hear it over the notes of the piano, "You like Saint Saëns." She hoped fervently that she was reading him right, that this was an extended invitation, and stepped further into the room, passing by the chaise and armchairs in the middle to stand nearer the window, to the side of the piano. "I don't know the name." "The Swan," replied Edward, not looking up from the keys. "Or the Dying Swan, if you prefer." "Of course. I heard it in town. They played the record constantly a few years ago, because a famous Russian ballerina was engaged at the theater in Columbus, and she was the Dying Swan. You could hear it out the window of all the shops and meeting houses." "Anna Pavlova," Edward noted, and Esme nodded, remembering the name now that he said it. "Did you see her dance?" Esme was surprised for a moment, but then remembered Edward was a stranger. No one who knew her or her life in Ohio would have asked such a question. She didn't go to see ballerinas. Charles would have thought her ridiculous for even asking. "No, my husband didn't like to go to the theater." She realized just as the words were leaving her mouth that she hadn't meant to say them. Carlyle he covered it well, but he missed a key when she said that, and she felt a small measure of satisfaction that he was curious about his brother. But mostly she felt foolish for having spoken of Charles. It was so difficult not to, even with him gone. He was constantly in her thoughts, complaining about her. She hated that she had to listen to him even now. There was no way around it. She remembered Carlyle's bequest yesterday, that they had been married just this year. "No, my first husband. We married right before the war, that is, before the country went to war. He died last year." Did Carlyle go over? He kept his tone devoid of any emotion, and she wasn't sure what he was trying to get at. "I am not sure," she admitted, knowing that it was a problem. "I didn't know him then." "Neither did I," Edward sighed with a touch of sarcasm, but Esme could tell he was surprised at her answer. She would have to ask Carlyle about these things, and anything else she would need to know if she was to convincingly be his wife. "Does he know you play the piano?" she asked, wanting to keep him talking. "I had lessons when he still lived here, if that's what you mean," he said. "From my mother. As far as I know, she was the only other one who played here." Esme nodded, trying to think of something uncontroversial to say next, but before she could Edward again stopped playing. But now he turned his whole body to look up at her, one leg swinging over the corner of the bench. "I didn't mean to ruin your dinner yesterday. I am not angry with Carlyle. I just haven't been pining away waiting for him to come save us for all these years. We aren't a family, really, we're only people who are related to each other. I don't see the point in acting like something else. I am not a good person." "What do you mean?" He had green eyes, she noticed as she looked down at him, only slightly. Edward was tall like his brother, and only just shorter than her standing height while sitting down. "I killed my mother, you know." His eyes didn't leave hers, almost as though he was searching for something. "My father, too, but Carlyle probably knows about my mother." "He told me your mother died of illness," Esme said softly. She let his cryptic words about his father lay for now. She knew he had died of pneumonia, and Edward had been away at school for months. Maybe he felt guilt about it, but it was misplaced, especially knowing what sort of a man he had been. He looked away and spoke slowly. "Yes, diphtheria, and it was my fault." "That's impossible." His mouth turned up at one corner, more grimace than smile. "One of the maids got it first, and she was nearly recovered when I got it, so we were confined to my room and she took care of me. My father and mother stayed away so they wouldn't be infected, because it only spreads through contact." Esme nodded, "But I was young and hadn't been away from her a day in my life. I cried for her through the door every day. She would sit against it on the other side for hours, crying too. She told me why she couldn't come in, but I didn't stop calling for her. All I wanted was for her to hold me. He wasn't looking at her anymore, but off to the side with an expression almost of disgust, as though he was watching his younger self and hating him. Esme felt tears pricking her eyes, imagining what it would be like as a mother, to hear your son, sick and calling desperately for you, and be unable to go to him or even see him. Joseph had barely cried, owing to how quickly he faded, but she had never denied him a moment of her attention in the days that they had together. In the days after he had died, she dreamt of him crying and being unable to find him, and always woke inconsolable. Finally she gave in. I was very sick, and the doctor told her I was likely dying. I heard him through the door when he thought I was incoherent. My father had ordered her not to go in, but while he was out of the house she came to me and kissed me, and made me swear not to tell my father. I began to recover the next day. She was in excellent health for the next 2 days, and then she developed a fever and told the doctor she knew she had caught it. He met her eyes again, now speaking with deliberate flatness. She choked to death the next night, and that is how I killed my mother, the one person who loved me. It wasn't your fault, she whispered, and she realized she was trying not to cry. She was embarrassed he had reduced her to tears like this, but mothers and sons and breathing and choking and dying. It wasn't my intention, he said, matter of fact. But it was my fault. Logically, I should have been the one who died, not her. So I could never be that angry with my father for how he treated me because I didn't have the right. He wasn't a good man, I don't mean to imply otherwise. But I got what was coming to me, in some divine justice way. No, Esme didn't even think about it, she whispered the word just as instinct. No, that's not true. And your mother would never want you to think such a thing. How do you know? The same miserable half-smile. Because I know that if I had been given the choice between my life and my son's, it wouldn't even be a question. It wouldn't even be a thought. Her voice caught, and she steadied herself before continuing. And any mother in the world would feel the same. She would be happy her baby lived. She hadn't meant to say baby. She had meant to say child. But her throat was too tight and the wrong word slipped out. He looked serious again, obviously noticing her tears. You had a son. She took a breath, regained her composure. I did. He only lived for 9 days. I am sorry to hear that. His eyes searched her expression, unsure, and she wondered for a moment what confused him until he said, Carlisle. Esme shook her head. Before him. Just several weeks before, but still. What was his name? She hadn't expected that from him. Joseph. He nodded. I am sorry, he said again. So am I, but the only thing I can do is try to go on. And love him. Still, the words sounded far too trite to be about what had happened. Joseph dying had been the worst thing, the thing that had shattered her life, broken as it had been before. But hearing herself reply to Edward made her realize that what she said was true despite that. It had been horrifying and terrible. She would eat glass and crawl through fire if it meant she could have even one more moment with him. But no amount of mourning would bring him back. She hesitated before speaking again. She didn't want it to seem as though she had come here to plead Carlisle's case to Edward. She hadn't, but she wanted Edward to know. You know, Carlisle said almost the same thing to me last night. That there was something about him that made your father treat him the way he did, and that was why he couldn't imagine it happening to you. She considered her next words carefully. Did you like Carlisle growing up? Edward chuckled humorlessly. He was a figure of great heroism to me. But I don't think that had anything to do with him personally. I am sure I would have felt the same way about anyone who stood in contrast to our father. Esme didn't agree, but didn't challenge it. How do you feel about him dying? She spoke plainly. But she thought that with all the tragedy between them, stories of dead mothers and dead children, he would forgive her for her bluntness. Edward raised his eyebrows. Some would say that's an odd question to ask. Because he's your father, so you should be sad. Or because he left me a fortune, so I should be happy. Depends on who you talk to, he said. But in either case, no one else has asked me. I think they've drawn their own conclusions. He gave her a sidelong glance. How did you feel when your first husband died? She knew he was trying to deflect from himself, turning her indelicate question back on her. But she told the truth anyway. I thanked God. Edward tried to hide his surprise, but it was a moment before he schooled his features back into a mask of solemn indifference. I thanked God because he wasn't the easiest to live with. But I found myself afraid, at times, of what my life would look like with him gone, because he had dominated it. And sometimes I remembered all his best moments, but they seemed much sweeter in hindsight than they had ever been at the time. I didn't miss him, but I thought to myself that probably I could have endured living with him the rest of my life, that it hadn't been too horrible for that. She had never cried over Charles, not one tear. But when she heard he had died, she remembered the time he had brought her flowers while courting her, the time she had nearly stumbled in the street and he caught her in his arms, the time she had made a joke while serving him supper and he actually roared with laughter. It was such a pathetic, meager collection of nice moments. Even when he wasn't hitting her, rarely had he been kind. But at the time, especially in the first few months when she had been sure she could improve herself to the point that he would stop hurting her, she had savored his every nicety. In an awful way, she was sure it was the fact that he was so awful the rest of the time that made her cling on to that. It seemed terribly wrong, that his reward for treating her badly was that any rare scrap of affection he tossed her way was so different, so lacking, that she had taken anything she could, like a starving person. I hated myself for feeling anything sorry towards him, even in passing. I had despised him while he lived. But death is so final, and he had occupied so much of my thoughts. I found myself reflecting on the familiar, because in some ways it was better than the unknown. She didn't say it, but even as she had thought to herself that it would have been possible to continue as things were with Charles, she knew it hadn't been true, it had been delusional thinking. Every day had been bad, but after the war had been the worst, much worse than before. The thought had come to her more than once as she lay on some floor of their house, hearing his pounding footsteps recede as pain bloomed over some part of her body. He is going to kill me before I turn 30. She knew in her heart that would have been true if he hadn't died first. Edward nodded. I don't care about the money. But the world is a better place without him, so I am glad no one has to see him again, he said quietly. For a moment it looked as if he would say more about it, but then he didn't. Your husband, he, wasn't good to you. There was no mistaking the meaning behind his words. Even though she had already admitted it, even though Carlyle knew, Esme still felt shame overwhelm her when she nodded. She hated people to know. Her parents had thought it meant she was a failure, but it was more than that. She hated to think that people knew she was broken like this. Then the world is a better place without him in it, too. More so. He shook his head, anger in his eyes, and she was touched to know his anger was for her. Then he looked at her again, cautious. My brother is, he pressed his lips together. Good to you. He didn't look angry when he said that. He looked almost nervous. Esme realized that for all his contemptuous exterior, some part of him still saw Carlyle as a hero, and he was afraid to be proven wrong. Of course he is. She nodded, looking at him intently. He's very good. And kind. She smiled. I couldn't ask for a better husband. And truly, she couldn't. He tried not to look pleased, but she saw the upward twitch of his mouth. Good. He shook his head. Even my father wouldn't stoop so low as to hit a woman. He wouldn't. When Edward spoke, she hadn't even considered the fact that his sister had lived here too, and what her experience had been, but she would be heartened if it wasn't quite as terrible as Edward's, just for the sake of there being a little less misery in the world. So he never harmed your sister? Edward's eyes grew distant and hard. No, only once. Carlyle spent the day far less productively than he would have liked. He acquainted himself with the current status of the most prominent of the Cullen family enterprises. One of the mines was in the process of repairing its elevator. A train laden with Douglas fir planks had departed this morning. There was a telegram from the Boeing Airplane Company in Seattle. Carlyle was told that his father had been in talks to acquire manned flying machines for the shipping business. It all could have proceeded easily, had every step of the way not involved so many greetings and questions. What had he been doing for the last decade? Why hadn't he come back earlier to work alongside his father? Were the other Cullen children returning as well? He gave politely noncommittal answers to all. He didn't wish to linger here for longer than necessary, aware that Edward and Esme were back at the house. With how Edward had reacted yesterday, he didn't like the idea of leaving him to stew further. And Esme, he was surprised to realize that he just looked forward to seeing her again. He had just spent the last 5 days on a train with only her company, and then alone with her at the house, but he hadn't tired of her, the opposite. He had felt adrift last night when Edward had had his outburst. He was right, of course. There was nothing about him and Edward, or his sisters, which qualified them as a family in any but the most biological sense, and even then, there wasn't a full sibling between the four of them. He had never seen Edward after being disowned by their father. He was aware of the sort of man he was, but he had never thought their father would turn on him. He had never been as harsh to Edward as he had been towards his eldest son. And Edward's mother had adored him. Esme's words had stilled the waves of self-recrimination, at least momentarily. He knew, logically, that there was little he could have done. Raising your hand to your children wasn't a crime, and even if it was, who would arrest William Cullen, who employed half the town? He had told Carlyle not to come back unless he was ready to be sensible. Objecting to the treatment of his siblings would not have been seen as sensible to the man. There was nothing more he could have done except stand by and watch the exact same thing play out before him. He knew all of this. He also knew that he should have been there. He should have found a way, should have made things different somehow. But that was in the past. All they could do was look to the future. And he wanted a future in which his siblings were a family, where they felt loved. There had been no chance of that when their father was alive, but now he was gone, and Carlyle wasn't going to stand by and leave them to their various relatives. He should have been there then, somehow. He would be here now, no matter what. After yesterday he could have no doubt that Esme was the perfect woman to have married for this purpose. Her kindness to Edward, who was a perfect stranger to her. Her kindness to him, when he was little more than that. He hadn't expected her to have to cook and clean, had worried she would think he had brought her here under false pretenses to be an unpaid maid. But she had made the old, dark house more livable, more welcoming, in just the few days she had been here. She was a remarkably resilient, compassionate, hard-working, practical, intelligent woman. And that was all he was allowed to admire about her. He had noticed when he first laid eyes on her in the hospital that Esme was beautiful. She had been at 16 and she was more so at 26. But there had been far more pressing concerns, such as checking for flail lung. His years of training and objectivity had allowed him to put those thoughts out of his mind. As she fully returned to health, though, whatever distraction any lingering injuries had provided were fading entirely. There was a sort of gentleness and thoughtfulness to her beauty he was sure came from her soul. She had a heart-shaped face with a small pointed chin, and a small straight nose across which a few freckles were faintly scattered, and large, round brown eyes, almost the same light coppery brown as her hair. Her lips were lush and full, the cupid's bow of her top lip so shallow it was almost non-existent. She wasn't even especially short for a woman, but there was a sort of delicateness to her that made her look soft and gracile and small. Not in the bony, boyish way that was coming into vogue in the cities, but the less he thought of the slender curves of her body, the better. He shouldn't be thinking about that at all. He wished, for the 1000th time since he had signed their marriage certificate, that Esme was plain. Then maybe marrying her would feel more like a penance, the way giving up practicing medicine was, and less like taking advantage of something he had no right to. He hadn't married her to be some sort of lover. She didn't want that and he didn't want to subject her to it. He also did not want that, he reminded himself. Mr. Michaels, he said, wrenching his mind away from loathing himself for finding his wife beautiful. His life was a complete joke, wasn't it? And remembering his promise to her. One of the errand boys might go to the grocer and have him update the standing order he brought my father every week. My wife has a list. Michaels had been the last in a long line of often fired secretaries to William Cullen and appeared to have regarded him in his memory with timidity, understandable, considering his father's fiery temper. Michaels seemed intelligent and helpful, and Carlyle had endeavored to be pleasant to the man, but that didn't stop him from approaching Carlyle with similar hesitation. Now, though, his eyes widened in surprise. Your wife, sir. She is at the house. Carlyle wondered if it was odd he hadn't yet mentioned her, but hoped his general terseness in speaking of his life before returning to Washington would excuse it. I'd also like to know about the domestic situation, when you return. There were no staff when we returned to the house, though I cannot believe my father did not retain staff when he died. Michaels nodded and went out to dispatch the grocery list. Carlyle returned to the desk that had been his father's and took up the most recently delivered letters from this morning. Most was business correspondence. One was personal, written in an unfamiliar hand and addressed to him from Seattle. Dear Mr. Cullen, I write on behalf of myself and my wife to send our condolences to you upon the death of your father, which we learned of in the Times. My wife, Victoria Brandon Wardlaw, is the younger sister of the late Anne Brandon, and thus she and her sister Naomi Brandon are the nearest natural relations to Anne and the late Mr. Cullen's daughter Mary Alice. Mary Alice being a still very young girl, her relatives are in agreement that it would be in her best interest to be with her mother's sister, who has 3 children of her own, to have the maternal influence and parental affection a young girl must be provided with, especially considering her ill health. We are not wealthy people, and there are already children here to clothe and house, and my wife's sister lives with us as well. But we could not conscience a young girl growing up in an unfit home and thus are willing to take her on as our own, into our household where she may live among her aunts and cousins. We are under the impression she has been returned to your late father's home, where you now reside, along with his other children. We cannot imagine it is easy or practical, or beneficial to anyone, that 3 minor children attempt to get along in their house now entirely without parental guidance and care. In mentioning the subject in passing to a lawyer, I am aware that the law would be likely to agree with us that Mary Alice's best interests would be to have care from a close relative and caring mother. We would like to relieve you of some of your burden. Yours sincerely, James Wardlaw. Carlyle cursed under his breath as he read the letter. Mary Alice's uncle had spoken to a lawyer. What a vulture, with his mentions of their thin budget and then their assurances that they would be willing to bring Mary Alice into their home. He had never heard from these people before. It was obvious they assumed Mary Alice would be receiving a large inheritance and were trying to use that to their advantage. They must be genuine relatives, he knew. He wasn't sure who outside of the Cullen estate knew of Mary Alice's existence. Edward was common knowledge, so was Rosalie, who had been acknowledged and given the Cullen name despite her illegitimacy. But Mary Alice had been raised in hospitals and sanitariums and health spas, never brought to live in Washington, and certainly never spoken of by their father. He couldn't imagine there were many who knew of her and her frailty other than her unfortunate mother's relatives. That only increased his distaste 1,000-fold. He wondered if they thought Mary Alice would be easy to control, because of her frailty, or if they just hoped she would die soon and leave her loving relatives her fortune. Both possibilities boiled his blood. If they had cared for her at all, they would have offered to take her in when her father was alive and ignoring her. And Carlyle was sure he would have agreed to offload her. He had been the heir. Edward had been the spare, and the beloved joy of his mother. Rosalie, at least until the scandal of last year, had been the proper, pretty daughter, ready to make a marriage that would cement some business deal or another. But Mary Alice had been an invalid, an embarrassing aberration. Carlyle knew it must have been her physical frailty which shamed their father and not the fact that her mother had been a domestic-turned-mistress. He was not a man who cared overly for proprieties such as wedlock, and he was rich enough that no one else could care much, either. But he had demanded much from his children, and the idea that he had produced an infirm daughter was perhaps too much to bear. He looked at the address on the letter again. The part of Seattle this had been posted from was soundly upper class. It reflected even more poorly on his mentions of their supposed poverty and sacrifice in taking their niece in. But would a court see it that way, or would they see an upstanding aunt and uncle trying to take in their ill niece against the protests of her elder brother, who had never met her before their shared father died? A court proceeding couldn't be risked. He would write to them and in no uncertain terms tell them Mary Alice was to live with her siblings, that was the best thing for her. Perhaps he would overstate the amount of care she might need, to intimidate them into going. Sir Michaels returned. I've sent one of the office boys to the grocer. You wanted to know your father's situation with the domestics. He engaged the local laundress. He had let the cook go a month before his passing following a dispute. There was a maid who also did the cooking after the departure of the cook, but she has taken a position with another family since his death. It might be necessary to place an advertisement in the city papers, or engage an agency there. This town is rather sparse for servants, and, well, he swallowed. There have been quite a few. My father went through servants quite quickly. Carlyle said it so the apprehensive man wouldn't have to. Either he dismissed them, or they left his employ. In any case, it seemed Esme would get her wish, at least for the time being. She was probably right that it was needlessly foolish to bring an unrelated stranger into the house just as the 4 Cullen siblings would be under the same roof for the first time in their lives. Thank you, Michaels, I'll leave that for my wife to decide. It was still extremely odd to mention his wife in conversation. Speaking of his wife, though, it was 5:30 and the offices were emptying. He dismissed for the day those who remained. On the drive home, he thought about what might be waiting for him, namely, how Edward was going to act this evening. On the drive back to the house yesterday, he had been terse but not impolite, but at dinner he had emphatically let Carlyle know how he felt, and Carlyle couldn't blame him for it. Yet he didn't want Edward to stay away and miserable forever. He wasn't sure how to fix any of it. And he couldn't help but agree with Edward, that he was driven by self-interest more than anything. He had long suspected he was little better than his father. His father had been violent, uncontrolled, but Carlyle had learned that well-placed words could be even more effective, Was that almost worse than using his fists and his threats to accomplish what he wanted? Certainly it was more insidious. This was selfishness, wasn't it, masked as morality. If he could bring the siblings together, if they could get along happily, he would feel quite so responsible for abandoning them in the first place. He had never let anyone close to him because he knew that beneath everything there was a disappointingly broken person. And yet he had never yearned to live his life alone, even as he thought he had resigned himself to it and accepted that fate. Perhaps he could have tried harder to find a solution for his siblings, for Esme, that did not involve him. Perhaps his mind had leapt immediately to a wife and a family because he had finally succumbed to his own loneliness, and it had made him selfish. Willing to drag others down alongside himself as long as it meant he would not be alone. He had often thought of practicing medicine as trying to make up for his presence in the world by putting some good back in it. Now he saw even that grimly reflected back at him. Had it all just been to satisfy himself, convince himself he was a better man than he knew he was? His father had drawn blood and made no apology, but he had drawn blood and been told he was a hero for it. Surely that was worse. His spirits brightened to see Esme in the foyer. Had she been waiting for him? No, that couldn't be. But as he walked through the door she smiled at him, and he was displeased at the way his heart lurched at the sight. Her hair was wrapped around the back of her head in a coiling braid. He wondered what it looked like entirely unbound. Then he hated himself all over again, the thought burning in his mind. This, too, was selfishness. He had wanted to protect her, had wanted to be able to keep her with him so she couldn't come to harm, had wanted, still wanted, her. And he had bound her to him. How could he have ever convinced her she was getting any benefit from this when he had sentenced her to life as his wife and to bring her to this house, and deal with hostility that he, not Esme, had earned, and to make her a part of this purpose which was looking more hopeless by the hour, to bring the children all under one roof? He had told himself he could think of no other way to help her. Perhaps that was wishful on his part. He should have thought of something more, he should have done something different. Yes, Carlyle was far worse than his father, who had never harbored any illusions of magnanimity. He was as selfish as the dead man had been, but he disguised his selfishness as some nobler purpose, even to himself. "I wasn't sure when you'd be back, so I haven't put supper out," she said. "You don't need to go to that trouble. We can eat in the kitchen." He took off his coat and hung it by the door, keeping his tone light. He didn't want to trouble her with this. If she sensed his dread she would try to comfort him, he was sure, and he did not deserve her comfort. "I already set the table, it's just the pork chops and the salad that I need to get. But first I'll get Edward. I think he's in the library." Once more, Carlyle admired her optimism in assuming Edward would care to come down and join them. But when she had gone he went into the kitchen and brought the food to the table for her. He noticed the electric kelvinator again. Of course there had been none when he left home. There had been electricity in the main part of the house but not the kitchen. He considered the possibility of hiring one of the women in town to cook meals they could keep cold until served. Maybe a woman who ran one of the boarding houses in town. He knew there were a few. The idea was unappealing to him even as he was determined to make sure Esme would not have to cook and clean like a hired hand. She was an excellent cook. He had expected Esme to return to the dining room alone, but to his surprise, Edward was behind her. He glanced questioningly at Esme, but she ignored any attempt to give her a significant glance, and he didn't try too hard for fear of Edward seeing. "Edward," he said when they sat down. He decided not to address the events of last night in some vain hope of a more congenial experience now. "I should have asked if you'd have liked to go into town with me today. I'll probably try to manage here until it's time to go to the station for your sister, but the next day I may go again, if you'd like to come with me." "I don't have any business in town," said Edward. He was quiet but not hostile. "But if I needed to I could drive father's car. It's in the back part of the carriage house. Esme could, too, if she wanted," he added, glancing at her where she sat across from him. It was subtle, but apparently Edward had taken a liking to Esme. Carlyle was extremely unsurprised, but wondered what had happened to change his mind. "Thank you, Edward, that's very considerate of you. I don't know how to drive a car, so I told your brother I might walk if I needed to go into town." Esme smiled. "You don't know yet," Carlyle broke in. "I told you, I'll teach you. It's a long walk into town," Edward sighed doubtfully. There was a hint of challenge in her eyes. "When I was in school I walked 2 miles each way, young man." "I wouldn't. The woods are full of bears," said Edward. He spoke very seriously, but Carlyle wondered if he wasn't saying it to tease her. Esme's eyes widened slightly. "Really? Yes, Carlyle interjected. Grizzly, black, he paused for effect. Polar bears, too. She looked between the two of them, a small smile spreading across her face. You are lying to me. At least about the polar bears. We had black bears in Ohio, that I can believe. Carlyle shook his head innocently. They wander down from Canada and Alaska. To his surprise, she looked at Edward with a grin. Is he telling the truth? Say he isn't. Edward shrugged nonchalantly. Well, and then his mouth twitched and it was apparent he was trying not to smile. Esme laughed aloud, and Carlyle couldn't deny he was slightly and stupidly disappointed that Edward had gotten her to really laugh before he had. She had a delightful laugh. He is lying. Oh, you're both awful. There can be bears in the woods, truly, so I wouldn't go out on foot by yourself, Carlyle said. We haven't seen a bear around here for years, Edward chimed in, and Carlyle wondered if he was going to argue, but then his brother glanced at him and said, but Carlyle's right. There are mountain lions, too. I'll take you two at your word, though apparently I have no reason to trust either of you, Esme said teasingly. Things proceeded delicately well from there. Carlyle was conscious of a sort of a cautious, silent armistice from Edward. He seemed more willing to give him a chance. In practice his behavior wasn't so different as it had been the day before. He was still quiet and mostly serious, not speaking much unless spoken to, and there were no more moments of levity. But unlike the day before, there were no angry outbursts either. It was more than Carlyle could have hoped for. He had been sure it would take days or weeks for Edward to stop lashing out and have a civil conversation. He felt sure Esme must have spoken to him today, somehow brought him around. But he also realized his original thought had been a misleading one. He didn't think Edward was the type to be constantly overflowing with shouting anger. He would be silent for a while, punctuated by an outburst when his thoughts became too much. He had been the same way once, though he tried to be the master of his passions now. At least, he tried not to let his temper get the best of him. Words and deeds done in the heat of anger were distasteful to him because he knew of their destructive consequence. It was odd to think of Edward in those terms, as a young man with traits similar to his own. The last time he had known him at all had been in between school holidays as a distant child always trailing after his mother. After supper, Esme reminded them that there was cake in the icebox. She kept calling it that, and he wondered if she had never seen a Kelvinator. Rejecting both Carlyle and Edward's offers to assist her in fetching the cake and coffee, she disappeared into the kitchen and Carlyle was left alone with his younger brother for the first time since he had driven him from the train, and the second time in nearly a decade. That ride had been silent. They both looked at one another. So you went to medical school, Edward said abruptly. I did. Carlyle hesitated to say it, unsure if it would set him off. I assumed father would have made it clear. What prompted him to disown me? When you left Princeton, my mother brought up your name at dinner, and father told her not to utter it again until you had regained your senses. Edward said. No one ever did again. Carlyle nodded. Obviously his father was confident that would happen someday, otherwise he would have changed his will, but Carlyle expected nothing less from the man. He had had an iron will and was not used to being denied anything. Was becoming a doctor the only way you could think of to get away from him? Edward said after the silence. I would think there are easier methods. He didn't have anything to do with studying medicine, said Carlyle. I decided to pursue it because I found the subject fascinating. And I was gratified to feel as though I was making some kind difference to people. He smiled wanly. Every profession makes some difference in the lives of others, obviously, including his. I suppose I am not very imaginative. I liked seeing the improvement before my eyes and know I accomplished it with my hands. But you've given it up. Out of necessity. Edward raised an eyebrow. All this is a necessity. He sounded incredulous. Our family is. He said the word cautiously, remembering Edward's outburst the night before. But today he didn't protest, he only smiled slightly as though amused at Carlyle, his naivety. One could say, though, that you and I and Rosalie and Mary Alice are only a family because of him. He's the only parent all four of us share. I've never even met Mary Alice. He expected Edward to continue, but he didn't. Yes, I suppose one could say that. Edward shrugged a shoulder. And we all hate him, and he's dead. I am not sure how that will make everyone into a family. They say blood makes a family, but we hate the blood. Or, love, some other people say, is the point of a family. But we don't love each other, either. He didn't sound angry as he had the night before, just resigned. Carlyle did not tell Edward how often he had wondered after his younger brother over the years. He would not pander and try to convince him of how he felt. It wouldn't do any good. His absence had spoken more loudly than any of his words could now. Perhaps it's just the fact that no one but us four in the world can say they had William Cullen for a father. We're a family because there's no one else. Edward hummed. Or maybe we forget him entirely. Become a family because we choose to be. Because it's better than being alone. Edward nodded slightly, though Carlyle doubted he had convinced him. He'd be furious you were here, he said finally, and didn't sound unhappy about it. Good, Carlyle said. Here it is. Esme returned with a tray, smiling, and Carlyle wondered if she had eavesdropped on them and delayed her return. But Edward stood up when she entered. Thank you, Esme, but I shouldn't have let you go to the trouble. I am not much for cake at the moment. Carlyle didn't protest. This was such a difference from the night before. He was inclined to let things be. And Esme only smiled serenely, a perfect hostess. Of course, Edward, and it's no trouble. Then Edward was gone. Carlyle met his wife's eyes as she set her tray down. That went well. It did. Esme beamed at him. His heart did a peculiar stammer which he ignored. As Carlyle readied himself for bed later that night, he continued to think on the rousing success of the evening. It had gone better than he had hoped for, and far better than he deserved. He decided to savor the moment of victory before Rosalie's arrival, because he already knew the two got on poorly. He was planning to try to sleep, but anticipated he might be up late into the night, perhaps reading. He had grown used to the sleeping habits of a doctor with regular turns-on shifts from sunset to dawn, and it made him restless to go to bed at a decent hour, especially after he hadn't done anything as tiring as he was used to while seeing patients. He already missed practicing medicine. Going without it for just over a week might have been a welcome holiday, if he didn't know that he was never returning to the thing he had loved. As it was, he felt, rather melodramatically, as though a large portion of his life had gone dark. He knew it could be worse, though. Medicine had been the only thing in his life, and he had thrown himself into the practice of it to distract himself from the fact that he was constantly alone. Now, he wasn't alone. Even if he could not do what he loved, it wasn't as if he didn't have many other responsibilities to fill his days. He was unbuttoning his shirt when he heard a very quiet knock on the adjoining door. He froze, his mind going blank and then swarming with thoughts. Nothing in him had even considered the possibility that he would see Esme after they both retired. He hoped there wasn't something wrong. He glanced down at his shirt, half open, and for the sake of decency, began to redo the buttons. He wondered if that was too ridiculous, to be hurriedly redressing himself in order to speak to the woman he was married to. A slightly louder knock. Cautiously, he opened the door. Esme was standing there. She wore a beige cardigan that was nearly falling off one of her pale shoulders, and he could see the pink ribbon strap of her white nightgown. Her hair was loose, the first time he had seen it like that, and he was surprised at how long it was, golden reddish-brown, slightly waving from her braid, falling almost to her waist. Her nightgown brushed the floor, the cardigan falling almost to her knees and past her wrists. There was nothing indecent about her appearance, except that she looked devastatingly intimate like this. His heart was hammering in his chest as though he were a schoolboy. Ridiculous. Is everything all right? He wondered if his voice really sounded odd, or if it just did to his own ears. With some effort, he forced his rationality to reassert itself. Do you need something? I am sorry to disturb you. She looked slightly apprehensive, but I wanted to speak to you, and I didn't want Edward to overhear. I know he's at the end of the hall, but... He nodded. Of course, you're not disturbing me at all. That wasn't exactly true. He felt distinctly disturbed, but that wasn't her fault. A radiant smile illuminated her whole face. He was beginning to find it was impossible not to smile when she did. Carlyle, we spoke today, and, oh, he's really such a sweet boy, and he isn't even very good at hiding it, he's just been hurt terribly. I found him playing piano upstairs. He plays beautifully, did you know that? I didn't, said Carlyle, feeling as though he should have. I remember Mrs. Cullen, that is, Elizabeth Masson, playing sometimes. Edward was always with her, and she would teach him. But I didn't know he had continued with it. He's wonderfully talented, Esme said. Her face fell. We spoke about his mother, too. He holds himself responsible for her death, you know. Carlyle frowned. Mrs. Cullen had died of something no one could be at fault for. For her illness. She caught it from him. And she died, and he lived, and, Esme's eyes grew far away. I told him about my son. I hope that was all right. I couldn't help it. I wanted him to know that his mother wouldn't want him to blame himself. Edward thought that he was sure their father had not disabused him of the notion. No, you are free to tell Edward and the other children whatever you wish about your life. And to withhold whatever you wish, if you would prefer to keep some things private. Esme nodded. I don't mind people knowing about Joseph. I think it's a good thing. I always hated that the only other people who ever knew of him were Charles' parents. They didn't deserve to remember him. She took a shaky breath. But I don't want to forget him. Everything has happened so quickly and my life is unrecognizable now. It kills me to think he has no place in it. I hope you will talk about him as much as you like, Carlyle said. I will always listen, but I don't think you have to worry about ever forgetting him, Esme. Your love for him is very apparent. There were tears in her eyes when she looked up at him, but she was smiling. Thank you for saying that. She sniffed, blinking the tears away. But I also wanted to ask you. Edward asked if you went over in the war and I didn't know how to answer. I realized I should know things like that, if they come up again. Of course, he didn't know why they hadn't spoken about all of that before, except perhaps that neither of them were particularly inclined to share much of their lives with others. You're right, I am sorry to have overlooked it. I went over to Rouen in the summer of 17, in the Medical Corps Reserve. I was a battalion medical officer for a while, and then put in reserve as a family practitioner to the local village population. That year and a half seemed to him now like a bloody haze, punctuated by devastating moments of crystal clarity, watching men die in a more senseless and cruel way than he had ever experienced before. She nodded. Charles was in Germany with the army. He wrote very infrequently, at least to me. He wrote to his mother more often, I think. His letters to me were mostly about how he didn't have as much money as he would have liked for the commissary. She smiled wanly. When did you marry Charles? February 1917. I was 22. He was 30. She pressed her lips together. He died last year, drank too much, and he fell and hit his head at the billiard hall he liked to spend the evenings at. No one took him back home because they weren't meant to be serving alcohol and didn't want trouble with the police. She shut her eyes. Carlyle was not much for revenge. Even against his own father he had never liked to imagine some terrible comeuppance. But that end seemed fitting for such a man as Esme described. She opened her eyes again, blinking away the memory. Oh, I know one. Where did you go to school? I had one semester at Princeton. It was principally socializing, parties, and posturing, none of which I cared for. I didn't see the utility of taking a degree in philosophy or business, as my father wanted, so I was accepted to Columbia, at the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the next year using money I had inherited from my mother. The curriculum was entirely lecture-based, though, and I wanted more experience, so in the summers I apprenticed in hospitals through the goodwill of my professors. That was how I ended up in Ohio in the summer of 1911. He allowed himself to think that her smile was at the memory of their first meeting. And why did you go back there? Where were you after you left the medical corps? It's my turn to ask a question of you, but I'll answer anyway. I was working in Ithaca, and dissatisfied with the procedures of the hospital there. They resisted adapting to many of the most important recent medical advances, and when it became apparent the older doctors would listen to nothing I said, I thought it time for a change. I had enjoyed my time here while I was at school, and I knew I would make more of a difference there, where there were few enough doctors that I might actually be listened to. He raised his eyebrows at her. What about you? What else should I know of you? Esme shrugged. Well, there isn't anything else, really. I stayed on the farm after high school. I'd have liked to go to college, but my parents wouldn't hear of it. My father died when I was 21, and we moved into town then because my mother didn't want to keep up the farm. I married the next year just to quiet her fretting that I would be a spinster forever. She smiled sadly. I thought that if I couldn't have adventure, and I couldn't have romance, at least I would have a family, which was what I had always wanted the most of all. Of course, Charles put an end to that dream, very quickly after the wedding. That is, I never wanted to bring children into a world with him in it. She looked so defeated when she said that. Growing up with a volatile, violent father, Carlyle had always hated the idea of being ruled by one's passions. He had very deliberately cultivated himself to be controlled, calm, rational at all times. But in that moment he could have killed the late Charles Evenson himself. Happily, with his hands. He wanted to tell her that he would give her whatever she wanted. If she wanted to study at a college, if she wanted to visit Paris or Rome or California. Once again, though, he doubted he could give her what she wanted most of all. Despite Edward's thought today, he wasn't sure if the 4 Cullen siblings could ever constitute a family. That reminded him of something he had meant to tell her outside of Edward's hearing. I received a letter today from Mary Alice's uncle and aunt implying they were willing to take the matter of her guardianship to court. Her eyes widened. What are you going to do? The same question had been on his mind all evening. Endeavor to keep the matter from becoming a legal issue. If that happens, there will be nothing I can do to change course. And I cannot imagine it would be good for any of the children, and especially not Mary Alice. He sighed. I will respond and outline my advantages in strong terms. Perhaps I will get our lawyer to read over the letter and see if he can add more of a subtle threat to it. With any luck, her uncle will see his fight would be pointless and abandon it. He's obviously an enterprising man, and he wouldn't do this without a good chance of succeeding. Esme nodded, tapping one finger against her lip thoughtfully. He didn't look at her rose-colored mouth. You should invite them to visit here after Mary Alice has settled in a bit. Perhaps in August. Visit here. The words didn't go together to Carlyle. The only people who came to this dark manor in the woods were Cullens or those they hired to serve them. His father had had visitors rarely, and usually as a matter of business. Edward's mother, the only Mrs. Cullen he had ever known, never gave dinner parties or otherwise played hostess. His father said there were no social equals in their town to socialize with. For the most part, the house felt as though it was a place to hide the family away. They didn't put themselves on display here. You can tell them anything you like, she said. But it would make a much greater impact if they could see all of the children living amongst one another, see them being a family with you. And hear from you in the flesh that you aren't going to let them take her away. They would be forced to put their ideas on hold until after the visit, regardless, and give you more time to help the children adjust. She was right. The idea was foreign to him, but he saw the wisdom in it. If I had faith that by August things would be going well, but he had no idea how things would look by August. I am still relieved every morning to see you haven't gone yet. I don't, he cut himself off, embarrassed to have said that even though it was true. He hadn't wanted her to know, but a part of him was sure that soon she would realize that she didn't want anything further to do with him or his family and leave. He wouldn't blame her. He had done something similar, hadn't he? You make it sound as though things are terrible here, Esme said softly. You saw Edward tonight. Things are already so much improved in just a day. But they'll want their answer soon, he said. I don't even know what condition Rosalie and Mary Alice are in. If things are that dire by August, tell them we've all come down with something contagious and they mustn't come here and catch it. You're a doctor. They'll have to believe you. He chuckled at her words, but her expression was earnest. But I think it will be all right, Carlyle, really. Why do you think that he wished he had her optimism? He had no idea how she had any, considering the life she had led, everything she had endured. Because look at how quickly Edward forgave you. He hasn't forgiven me. He has. He never wanted to be angry in the first place. It's just easier to be angry than afraid. Esme pulled her cardigan closer around herself. Maybe you can't see it because you can't forgive yourself. Well, of course he wasn't going to forgive himself. The thought sounded self-indulgent and ludicrous. Esme was too kind to understand that he didn't deserve forgiveness. The reason for his guilt wasn't that he could have done anything to change things for the children, but because he had enjoyed being away. He had been glad to have the excuse to stay away. He had enjoyed being a doctor, had enjoyed being away from his father. He could not say with absolute certainty that he would have returned if he could have. And he would not forgive himself for that. He didn't deserve forgiveness. But he didn't say that. He didn't want her to know it. He smiled reassuringly, the practiced, confident smile he gave to patients, no matter their condition, to show that he wasn't troubled and they shouldn't be either. I am all right. I just worry about him. Being 17 isn't easy at the best of times. You're right, she said, but he knew she didn't believe him. There was an unsettling frankness in her eyes. This was the downside of having a wife, he thought ruefully to himself, at least, to having Esme as his wife. She was beautiful and kind and made breakfast, but sometimes she looked like she saw right through him, and that was jarring. He had deliberately crafted a composed, pleasant exterior to show the world, and it was unsettling to think that someone saw through to all of the problems and brokenness underneath after all these years. She looked as though she wanted to say something else, but thought better of it. Good night, Carlyle. Good night. He was seized by the impulse to touch her somehow. Take her hands, kiss her forehead. Of course, he didn't do anything of the sort. Her eyes held his a moment longer and then she stepped back, and he glanced away as she closed the door and left him alone again. What he really wanted, he realized, was to keep talking to Esme. Human desire was an odd thing. He had always known it was better to be alone, but that hadn't stopped him from wishing there was someone to talk to in the evenings, some time spent not at work and not alone. Now he had that, and instead of being satisfied he wished for more. Selfishness. It had been downcast and raining off and on throughout the past few days, but the next morning the sun rose on a bright sky with only a few clouds. That cheered Esme, although she hadn't disliked the rain. It was peaceful. Sometimes during summer in Ohio the sun felt merciless and scorching, as though it would seek you out no matter where you went. No one was in the kitchen for breakfast when she came in, and the reason was immediately apparent upon finding the woodbox empty and the stove cold. She heard a sharp chopping noise outside, and looked out the kitchen door to find Carlisle and Edward in their shirt sleeves, splitting logs. They were situated facing away from her and evidently didn't hear the door when it closed behind her, and she took advantage of their lack of notice to watch them for a moment. Certainly there is, but it's a structure of understanding and language, not a real actuality unless combined with matter. Carlisle said, before decisively bringing down his axe. So you're rejecting the platonic ideal, to Edward Said, his voice light and challenging, and then split another log, tossing it into the wheelbarrow resting beside them. It was not very full. They must have only just started their task. I don't see how it can be a property of an object. When Carlisle did the same, he turned enough to catch sight of her, watching with her arms folded from the kitchen step, and he smiled. Esme, good morning. I should have done this yesterday, but I didn't realize the situation in the woodbox was so dire. And I was afraid if you discovered it first you'd come out here and start chopping wood yourself. And what would the neighbors think? Edward asked, glancing with a smile at their isolated surroundings as he threw down his axe. If anyone saw me trying to split logs they'd think I was a very foolish woman, said Esme as she reached them. What in the world are the two of you talking about? Logical positivism, said Edward. The newest wave of German philosophical nonsense. Nonsense? Carlisle asked, clearly in jest, and Edward shrugged one shoulder. She was thrilled to see their animation and lightheartedness. Edward's been led astray by some Greco-Roman at his school, no doubt. Edward actually smiled, shaking his head. I am glad you've been having such a stimulating conversation, she said, looking up at Carlisle with a smile. And thank you for refilling the woodbox. Perhaps I can take some now to start the stove and put on some coffee. Saying that, taking in the whole scene, she was nearly overwhelmed by the rush of affection she felt for both of them. I'll take them in for you, said Carlisle, putting aside his axe, and he picked up an armful of logs and walked with her back towards the house. You looked as though you and Edward were having a nice time, she said brightly once they were out of earshot. You both like philosophy. He's very bright. She opened the door for him and he tossed the wood into the woodbox, glancing at Edward out the window above the stove. He had resumed his task. He was already outside when I got there, just sitting on the veranda. I hope he slept. Esme nodded. She hadn't slept particularly well the night before either, so she wasn't sure what to say. She was sure she had dreamt about her son, but she didn't have any memory of what had happened, only a deep sense of melancholy and loss when she woke up in the night. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but it distressed her very much as she lay in the dark, the tears sliding out of the corners of her eyes and down the hollows of her cheeks to her neck. Ridiculously, she had considered getting up and going to the kitchen for a glass of water because she wondered if perhaps Carlisle would hear her and emerge from his room. She didn't want to be alone. She wanted to talk to him. She hadn't, of course. It smacked of the girls who would drop hankies on the ground at town dances hoping to catch the attention of a man to pick it up for them. And that wasn't her situation at all. She had just lay there in the dark and probably drifted back to fitful sleep before the sun rose. She wasn't sure what had woken Edward so early, but it could have been any number of his own troubles. Well, thank you for the kindling, she said, even more determined to be cheerful today and keep everyone's spirits high. I'll try to repay your efforts when you come inside. Evidently she was doing a good job projecting cheer, because Carlisle seemed extremely pleased. As he turned to leave outside, he lingered in the doorway for a moment as if to say something more, and then just smiled at her and went out. She was glad he was doing so well with Edward, glad he was so pleased. There was always something tentative in his smile, as though he disbelieved any pleasure or happiness that came to him. Maybe he did. Esme could understand that very well. When he was gone, she looked in the icebox and was pleased to see milk was left. She was going to make pancakes. She hadn't made pancakes for years, Charles hadn't liked them, and his parents always wanted hot cereal for breakfast when she kept house for them. She burnt the first one slightly, and then worried that she had forgotten how to do it right since before she had married Charles. But then the next one turned out better, and the one after that was nearly perfect, and her worries were assuaged and she just made a mental note to put the burnt ones aside for herself. It was nearly an hour later that Edward and Carlisle came inside, taking armfuls of wood from the wheelbarrow in the doorway to fill up the woodbox, looking flushed and accomplished and still in high spirits. Esme had coffee ready by then, and had set plates around the table in the kitchen. She watched as they washed their hands with the water pump next to the sink basin. Illogically, somehow next to Edward, Carlisle looked younger, or perhaps just less weighed down by guilt, and next to his brother, Edward's youth was even more apparent and pronounced, at least to Esme. He was a tall, good-looking boy, but not much more than child, really. "Did you resolve your differences on German philosophy?" she asked, and Edward shrugged one shoulder. "Perhaps you'll be our tiebreaker, Esme. Where do you stand on the thingness of things?" "I am afraid I don't know much about it," she said, and tried not to feel a pang of awkwardness. She had always known that Carlisle was highly educated, not just in the medical field but in all sorts of other subjects as well. It was obvious that Edward had similarly received an expansive education, despite being too young for university yet. She felt very conscious of the fact that she had a high school education from a tiny public school outside of Columbus, supplemented only by voracious reading. If her mother had had her way she wouldn't even have had the diploma. She had wanted her daughter married by 18. "Well, it's very simple," said Edward, paying no mind to any hesitation in her voice. "You're eating a burnt pancake." She nodded. "This one," he gestured to his own plate, "isn't burnt. But they're both pancakes. If you burn a pancake, it doesn't become something else, it's still a pancake. Why do they belong to the same class of thing? Because they both have pancake-ness." "Pancake-ness," Esme repeated with a short laugh. "That's the thing that makes them pancakes. It's the essential element of a thing. Without that element, the thing would be a different thing. In that case, pancake batter, being flat, things that if they were removed, it wouldn't be a pancake. Chairs have chair-ness, bowls have bowl-ness, and so on." Esme nodded, actually intrigued by the idea. She had thought Edward was joking with her at first, but she could grasp the concept he spoke of. "And what about people? Do you have Edward-ness?" "Everyone does have an essential quality of self," Carlisle broke in. "Some people think of it as the human soul." The way he said it made Esme sure that he was one such person. "What qualities make up the soul, then?" she asked. "Personality, or appearance, or," she trailed off. That idea didn't sound right. "It's more intangible than that," said Carlisle. "That is, if you dyed your hair black tomorrow, you wouldn't not be Esme anymore. Your appearance doesn't change who you are, it's simply an accidental quality." Esme smiled. "That's where you're wrong. When women dye their hair they proclaim themselves new women entirely." Carlisle chuckled. She went on. "But I think I understand it, then. Personality wouldn't be the soul either, at least not in the sense that I can change my behavior. If I am a gossip I can stop gossiping and I still will be me. But perhaps in a deeper sense it is personhood at its most innate, beyond the traits we adopt and develop over the years in response to our experiences." "Exactly," Carlisle said with a grin. He seemed genuinely pleased by her grasp of the idea. She couldn't help but smile back. "Will you dye your hair and become a new woman, Esme, or cut it? In the cities women are cutting their hair off in droves to look more like men," Edward Said mocked seriously. "I don't think that is why they are doing it, Edward," Esme replied. "But I have never felt so inclined." "That's good," said Carlisle, quietly. "That is, you should do what you like. But you have very lovely hair." She felt herself smile again, and hoped she wasn't blushing. Breakfast continued, friendly and surprisingly lively, but she found herself constantly falling behind in contributions because she kept sitting there and taking in the scene before her. An unusually pleasant moment in this house, to be sure, but even the bad ones were 1,000 times better than what she had left behind in Ohio. The more she thought about it, the more she liked the idea of Carlisle's souls. That meant that there was something in her unshaped by everything that had happened, when sometimes it felt as though everything lingered on brokenly inside her, malfunctioning even now because of the past. She liked the idea of there being a part of her that Charles had never been able to touch. When breakfast had drawn to its close, Esme stood as though to clear the table, and Carlisle hurried to disabuse her of the notion. I'll clear the dishes. I am sure you have things to do. She frowned at him. What an odd thing to be sure of. Clearing the dishes is the only thing I have to do. I am sure that's not true, and furthermore, I insist. He thought, for the 1000th time, that he needed to obtain a maid sooner rather than later. Every time Esme cooked or set the table he had to wonder if she thought he had brought her here to cook and clean. He hated feeling as though he had misled her somehow. You'll do the dishes? Edward asked, eyebrows raised. If you're wondering whether I am capable, of course I am. I lived as a bachelor. He had been about to remark on the years he had been caring for himself and suddenly thought better of it, remembering that they were lying to Edward, or at least deceiving him. For all my life, until I was married. Fine, then, I yield to you, thank you. She gave a small smile, but looked less happy than she had before when they had been joking about philosophy over breakfast. He wondered if she also felt guilty that Edward did not know the truth. And yet telling him was not something Carlyle would consider. Everything was still so fragile, despite the unexpected pleasantness of this morning. The situation with the Cullen siblings was like a brutally injured patient. The bleeding had to be stopped before any more delicate work could get started. I think I'll go into town today, even though the offices are closed. You're welcome to come with me, Esme, you too, Edward, of course, but this would be Esme's first visit. I'd like that, said Esme, and Carlyle had not expected her to look so pleased about the idea. He hoped she didn't feel he had been keeping her captive here. I'll go get ready to go out. Esme had already washed everything she had used before setting the table, so it was an easy task to set about finishing what remained. Edward lingered in the kitchen, watching Esme leave as he leaned against a row of cabinets. Carlyle could see he wished to speak to him, but when the door closed behind Esme he said nothing, and Carlyle decided to stay silent, too. He didn't want to push the boy too far. I didn't think men were supposed to wash dishes for their wives, Edward Said at last, speaking in a decidedly offhand tone. I suppose not, Carlyle said evenly. But I am the one responsible for obtaining a maid, and so the delay is my fault. Edward didn't say anything for a long while. Carlyle finished the short task without hearing another word from him. I think I'll be in the study until Esme is ready to leave, he said. Why did you marry Esme? The lightness from this morning was gone, and Edward looked at him intently. Edward was very fond of his new sister-in-law, it seemed, ready to champion her from any harm, including himself. Carlyle supposed he couldn't blame him. He was a stranger to his younger brother still. I mean, aren't you afraid to bring someone close enough to be in your life that way? I am not sure what you mean. I mean, do you think you'll end up just like him? Edward asked in a low voice, looking straight forward. Isn't there even a part of you that thinks that there isn't anything you can do to prevent it? He supposed he shouldn't be surprised that Edward feared that, too. He was our father, not our fate. You know that they say about apples and trees. That's a choice. That's not inevitable. I decided long ago, watching him, that I would never make people in my power feel the way that he had. I wouldn't let myself be ruled by my anger and use it as an excuse to be brutal. Edward swallowed hard, and glanced away. How? It takes practice. Of course he had been choleric and malformed when he was Edward's age, raised the way he had been. He was still malformed now, but in a different, less obvious way, and he supposed that was the best that could be done. When I was here I always felt under fire, and even when I was away that was all I knew. Approaching the world like a caged animal will make you forget yourself, lash out because everything feels desperate and risky. Booty knew that I did not want to be that way. I can control myself. He reached out and put a hand on Edward's shoulder. He stiffened but didn't shrug it away, though his eyes remained resolutely forward, staring at the opposite wall. Edward, I haven't seen you in years and I can still tell you're already not like him. You don't know that, Edward sighed quietly, and there was something pained and resigned in his voice that made Carlyle feel cold. He turned away before Carlyle could respond. Carlyle watched him leave the kitchen and heard him on the back stairs. Was it possible Edward was referring to the death of his mother? Esme had told him he blamed himself, but he had to know that her illness wasn't his fault, and had nothing to do with the nature of their father. He walked into the front hall for his gloves and his hat. Esme descended the staircase just then. To go out, she had changed from the skirt and blouse she had worn to breakfast. Her dress was sky blue linen, with a white collar and a wide sash that tied at the waist. She had tied a blue ribbon around her head and through her hair, gathered into a knot at the nape of her neck. The blue brought out the hint of copper red in her hair. He realized his gaze was lingering too long when she smiled at him inquiringly and he hurried to say something. I don't think Edward will be joining us, but we can leave whenever you're ready. We can leave now, then, Esme said. Unless you think I should bring a raincoat. You should be fine. The weather here tends towards clouds but it doesn't turn quickly, Carlyle said, glancing out the high windows at the sun filtering dimly through the clouds. This is considered quite cheerful weather here. She waited on the front doorstep while Carlyle brought the car out of the carriage house, and he helped her in. The steering takes a bit of strength to get used to, but when the car is in motion it becomes smoother, he said, as he started the engine and they began to drive down the road that led out of the woods and into town. If you'd like, you can drive back home. Esme shook her head. I couldn't do that, just to get the feel for it, before you have a car of your own. He could tell she was going to protest again. If you have no way of leaving the estate it'll feel as though I've marooned you there. I already regret it's taken me so long to bring you to town. You lived in the city before and things here are so isolated. I lived in the city for a few years, and before that on a farm with no neighbors for miles in either direction, she replied. And I haven't at all felt marooned. There's been so much to do. He knew how to make her agree. But I think you should know how to drive when I am in town at the offices more frequently, or traveling, at least. Edward may not always be available and if you or one of the girls needed assistance or just to go to town, you should have your own car. She pressed her lips together and he knew that she was in agreement. She was very averse to, and almost suspicious of, anything meant for her enjoyment. He wanted the car so she could go where she pleased, even if her options were limited in Forks. It was selfish, too. He did not want the feeling of keeping her captive in the dark house against her will, one prison in Ohio exchanged for another in Washington, and even more than that he wanted to know every day that she could leave, and yet she did not. If that was true then he could almost let himself believe that she wanted to be here, and not just because anything was better than where she had been before. He was quiet after that, because Esme was looking at their surroundings as they emerged from the forest and into town. Forks was more populous and more developed than it had been before his departure, nearly a decade before, but its remoteness kept it sparser than the small towns that had surrounded Columbus, or anywhere in New York Carlyle had lived before arriving in Ohio. Nothing was paved, and the main street contained nearly everything there was to the town: 2 boarding houses, a church and a barber shop, the police station, and a general store that appeared to have expanded into the next-door building in the years he had been away. The office was the tallest building in town, with a brick spire, built at the end of the street, and past that were rows of small, straight-framed houses. He could see the people milling about the road and in front of the buildings all noticing them. The fact that he had returned after his father's death certainly was common knowledge now, and surely the fact that he was married had to be, but no one had yet seen his wife except Chief Swan. Carlyle doubted the man was much of a gossip. The offices are closed, Carlyle said, resisting as he always did calling them his father's offices. That wasn't true anymore, as much as he did not feel any part of this was his, either. But I thought you might like to stop at the store. Yes, please, Esme said, turning from where she had been looking out the open side of the car where she sat. Carlyle had left the roof down given the relatively good weather today. I've got to talk to them about where I can have clothes made. If Mary Alice is coming from Florida I doubt she's going to have anything warm. He had not even thought of that, when in mere weeks he would be driving to Port Angeles to retrieve her. He stopped the car in front of the store. Before he could say anything or exit to help her out of the automobile, she caught his eye again, raising her eyebrows at him. Everyone is looking. He could see that was true out of the corner of his eye. The men smoking by the hitching posts across the street, the group of women chatting on the porch of the general store, and the girl beating a carpet on the second-floor veranda of one of the boarding houses had all fallen silent to surreptitiously glance their way. Are you all right? He knew she would say yes, but he searched her expression for discomfort. I am sorry about this. I don't think it will continue once everyone has seen you in us and satisfied their curiosity. When she smiled at him, though, she seemed genuinely unworried. I have lived in town before, you know. I know, he said quickly, before realizing she was teasing him. Her smile widened and he exited the car to get her door and help her down. When he opened the door he heard the jangle of a bell and the sibilant whispers of everyone in the store, who had been silently watching them through the panes of glass, pretending to return to their own business. His eyes met Esme's, and she was biting back a smile. Dr. Cullen, greeted Mr. Newton. He was standing behind the long counter which ran nearly the whole length of one wall. Behind him there were shelves of jars and cans and boxes and tools. In the glass cases underneath the counter there were boots and hats and gloves. There was a jar of penny candy sitting on the counter. The store had been much smaller when Carlisle had last left, selling only the basic essentials of daily life for a working man alone. Now there were items for women and children. "It's a pleasure to see you here. My wife and I were very sorry to hear about the elder Mr. Cullen." "Thank you," Carlisle said. Everyone had said that to him at least once. He wondered if there was even one person in the town for whom it was true. "Mr. Newton, this is my wife." The fact that he had been practicing medicine while he was away had gotten around, evidently, he reflected. "How do you do?" said Esme with a smile. Everyone in the store had given up the pretense of browsing for their own wares and was openly watching. "An honor to meet you, Mrs. Cullen. I hope you've received a warm welcome from the town." "This is a very charming place," Esme said. "I was hoping to inquire about ordering some clothes for my sisters-in-law." Mr. Newton's eyes widened in understanding. Carlisle had been fairly certain that few in Forks knew there was more than one Cullen daughter, and he had been hearing whispered speculations since he arrived about whether or not they would all be returning here now that their father was dead. But he remained polite. "Of course, Mrs. Cullen, my wife can help you with that." He gestured, and Mrs. Newton approached from the end of the counter where she had been standing with a few ladies, by the large window at the front of the store. Esme thanked him and met Mrs. Newton where she was, so that all the ladies were now standing together, and Carlisle felt slightly apprehensive to see her go off on her own. Maybe it was for his own sake more than hers. When she left his side he felt oddly exposed. "Don't worry, doctor, my wife will make sure she has everything they need," Mr. Newton said jovially, glancing over at the women with a smile. Carlisle realized he had been staring after her. "Have you got any children of your own, doctor?" "No, we haven't," said Carlisle. As he spoke, he restrained himself from glancing back over at Esme. She was fine, and he didn't want to look as though he didn't trust her to carry on a simple interaction at a store, and he did trust her. He just hoped the women didn't ask her too many prying questions under the guise of pleasantries, which was what he knew was about to happen to him. A young shop clerk who had been working on the far side of the store now came closer, leaning his elbows on the counter, and two men who had been discussing something in the glass case turned towards them as well, all interested in the conversation. "Now we know what Mr. Carlisle was doing all these years away," one of them laughed. "Finding himself a pretty wife. And he did very well." Carlisle smiled pleasantly but said nothing, not wanting to encourage that kind of talk. He would have had to go away to do it. "Aren't enough girls for that in Forks," said the other man at the glass case. "Mike, how many girls are in your school?" His was directed at the young clerk, who considered for a moment. "Who will be in the junior class? 9, I think. Maybe 8, because Lauren Mallory's engaged and she won't go back if she's married." "Most men here go to Port Angeles to find wives," said Mr. Newton, nodding. "Or else Seattle. Most of the women there aren't worth finding," said the first man at the glass case, dismissively. "Why are there so few women here?" "There are families here now," Carlisle asked. It was something that had been easier to understand when he had lived in Forks as a child, where the town was mainly populated by bachelor working men. "The daughters go to the cities to find work. There's nothing at the lumberyards or the mines for them," Mr. Newton said with a shrug. "Some of the girls become domestics, but most families don't have need of any, and they could never keep them long at." The first man at the glass case was cut off by his companion, who nudged him sharply. Carlisle knew he was speaking of his father. He knew, too, that these men, even trying to be friendly, would always see him and his family as set apart from the rest of the town. That was a power his father had wielded irresponsibly. Carlisle was about to reply, but he saw Esme was returning to him. "Did you find everything you need?" "Oh, yes, everything is worked out." She was holding a small paper parcel, but he could see through the open top of it that she had just bought some chocolate. Carlisle took it from her and said their goodbyes. "I thought I had better not order any gloves or shoes for the girls until they are here, since those can't be refitted," said Esme when they were back in the car. "I ordered a girl's coat for Mary Alice. They're going to charge it to the grocery account. It was $8, but for nightgowns and things like that she said we'd do better to go to Port Angeles, where they have a clothing shop. I know the place she's speaking about. My father had his suits made there. Perhaps we could go there after the girls are both here, so they could choose some things themselves. I don't know what young girls like nowadays, and I am sure they'd be very pleased to make their own choices. Mary Alice can borrow some of my things until then." Carlisle nodded. "Certainly. There's always some reason for me to go to Port Angeles for business." I hope you weren't questioned too much in there. Oh, no, Esme said. They were just curious. And I needed to buy some chocolate because I am going to make a cake tomorrow for Rosalie coming. She looked at him with a frown. Edward seemed so unhappy about her arrival. They don't seem to get along well. I suppose that's natural with some brothers and sisters. And they have more reason to than most, I suppose. Edward's mother wouldn't have her in the house while she lived, so Rosalie was kept at boarding school year-round, until Mrs. Cullen died and my father brought her to Forks. So perhaps she blames him for being kept away. And perhaps he resents her because she was brought to live in Forks so soon after his mother died. Esme pressed her lips together. But that was long ago. How long has it been since you saw her last? 10 or 11 years ago now. After my first semester of college, when I was home for the winter holiday. I was near her boarding school in Seattle and took her out for a day, to a tea room. My father didn't bring her to Forks to live until after Edward's mother died, so she spent all her early holidays at school. Rosalie was the only one of his siblings who had ever seemed attached to their father. Carlisle avoided him in his violent rages, and Edward clung to his mother for protection. It was probably because he kept Rosalie at arm's length, and she didn't have to see how he was at home. She had been a bright little girl with a wide smile, but her feelings of loneliness and rejection had been obvious on the few occasions Carlisle had seen her. She was constantly waiting for their father to visit her for a few hours when he was in Seattle on business, but that was rare. Most times he was in the city he did not come to call, and this time, when she had bounded into her school's sitting room for visitors to see only Carlisle, her face had fallen with disappointment. Carlisle had felt sorry for her on that visit and bought her drinking chocolate at the tea room and 2 fistfuls of peppermint sticks for her to share with the other girls whose families left them at school over Christmas. How sad, Esme said. Maybe for the best, though, since your father, she let the sentence taper off, but they both knew what she meant. Carlisle nodded. She wasn't being kept from anything particularly festive. Christmas was quite grim at the house. Mrs. Cullen made a bit of an effort in her first few years after being married, but she very quickly gave up the enterprise. And, he added, in a slightly lighter tone, that was the year I told my father I would not be returning to Princeton, and that I had already enrolled in medical school, and he told me not to return until I could be sensible. They were coming up on the house now. It loomed darkly over them. You were kind to her. I am sure she'll be glad to see you again, Esme said, but they both knew she was being optimistic. Guilt crawled up the back of his neck. He could already anticipate tomorrow going badly, and that reminded him anew that she had wanted a family and instead he had brought her to all of this. Hope you all liked the video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.